Chapter 48. By the time the state Supreme Court came to pass upon Cowperwood's plea for the reversal of the lower court and the granting of a new trial, the rumor of his connection with Eileen had spread far and wide. As has been seen, it had done and was still doing him much damage. It confirmed the impression, which the politicians had originally tried to create, that Cowperwood was the true criminal and Stenner the victim. His semi-legitimate financial subtlety, backed indeed by his financial genius, but certainly on this account not worse than that being practiced in peace and quiet, and with much applause in many other quarters, was now seen to be Machiavellian trickery of the most dangerous type. He had a wife and 2 children, and without knowing what his real thoughts had been, the fruitfully imaginative public jumped to the conclusion that he had been on the verge of deserting them, divorcing Lillian, and marrying Eileen. This was criminal enough in itself, from the conservative point of view, but when taken in connection with his financial record, his trial, conviction, and general bankruptcy situation, the public was inclined to believe that he was all the politicians said he was. He ought to be convicted. The Supreme Court ought not to grant his prayer for a new trial. It is thus that our inmost thoughts and intentions burst at times via no known material agency into public thoughts. People know, when they cannot apparently possibly know why they know. There is such a thing as thought transference and transcendentalism of ideas. It reached, for one thing, the ears of the 5 judges of the state Supreme Court and of the governor of the state. During the 4 weeks Cowperwood had been free on a certificate of reasonable doubt, both Harper Steger and Dennis Shannon appeared before the judges of the state Supreme Court and argued pro and con as to the reasonableness of granting a new trial. Through his lawyer, Cowperwood made a learned appeal to the Supreme Court judges, showing how he had been unfairly indicted in the first place, how there was no real substantial evidence on which to base a charge of larceny or anything else. It took Steger 2 hours and 10 minutes to make his argument, and District Attorney Shannon longer to make his reply, during which the 5 judges on the bench, men of considerable legal experience but no great financial understanding, listened with rapt attention. 3 of them, Judges Smithson, Rainey, and Beckwith, men most amenable to the political feeling of the time and the wishes of the bosses, were little interested in the story of Cowperwood's transaction, particularly since his relations with Butler's daughter and Butler's consequent opposition to him had come to them. They fancied that in a way they were considering the whole matter fairly and impartially, but the manner in which Cowperwood had treated Butler was never out of their minds. 2 of them, Judges Marvin and Rafalski, who were men of larger sympathies and understanding, but of no greater political freedom, did feel that Cowperwood had been badly used thus far, but they did not see what they could do about it. He had put himself in a most unsatisfactory position, politically and socially. They understood and took into consideration his great financial and social losses, which Steger described accurately, and one of them, Judge Rafalski, because of a similar event in his own life, insofar as a girl was concerned, was inclined to argue strongly against the conviction of Cowperwood. But, owing to his political connections and obligations, he realized that it would not be wise politically to stand out against what was wanted. Still, when he and Marvin learned that Judges Smithson, Rainey, and Beckwith were inclined to convict Cowperwood without much argument, they decided to hand down a dissenting opinion. The point involved a very knotty one. Cowperwood might carry it to the Supreme Court of the United States on some fundamental principle of liberty of action. Anyhow, other judges in other courts in Pennsylvania and elsewhere would be inclined to examine the decision in this case. It was so important. The minority decided that it would not do them any harm to hand down a dissenting opinion. The politicians would not mind as long as Cowperwood was convicted, would like it better, in fact. It looked fairer. Besides, Marvin and Rafalski did not care to be included, if they could help it, with Smithson, Rainey, and Beckwith in a sweeping condemnation of Cowperwood. So all 5 judges fancied they were considering the whole matter rather fairly and impartially, as men will under such circumstances. Smithson, speaking for himself and Judges Rainey and Beckwith on the 11th of February, 1872, said, "The defendant, Frank A. Cowperwood, asks that the finding of the jury in the lower court, the State of Pennsylvania versus Frank A. Cowperwood, be reversed and a new trial granted. This court cannot see that any substantial injustice has been done the defendant." Here followed a rather lengthy resume of the history of the case, in which it was pointed out that the custom and precedent of the Treasurer's office, to say nothing of Cowperwood's easy method of doing business with the city treasury, could have nothing to do with his responsibility for failure to observe both the spirit and the letter of the law. "The obtaining of goods under color of legal process," went on Judge Smithson, speaking for the majority, "may amount to larceny. In the present case, it was the province of the jury to ascertain the felonious intent. They have settled that against the defendant as a question of fact, and the court cannot say that there was not sufficient evidence to sustain the verdict. For what purpose did the defendant get the check? He was upon the eve of failure. He had already hypothecated for his own debts the loan of the city placed in his hands for sale. He had unlawfully obtained $500,000 in cash as loans, and it is reasonable to suppose that he could obtain nothing more from the city treasury by any ordinary means. Then it is that he goes there, and by means of a falsehood, implied if not actual, obtains $60,000 more. The jury has found the intent with which this was done. It was in these words that Cowperwood's appeal for a new trial was denied by the majority. For himself and Judge Rafalski, Judge Marvin, dissenting, wrote, "It is plain from the evidence in the case that Mr. Cowperwood did not receive the check without authority as agent to do so, and it has not been clearly demonstrated that within his capacity as agent he did not perform or intend to perform the full measure of the obligation which the receipt of this check implied. It was shown in the trial that as a matter of policy it was understood that purchases for the sinking fund should not be known or understood in the market or by the public in that light, and that Mr. Cowperwood, as agent, was to have an absolutely free hand in the disposal of his assets and liabilities so long as the ultimate result was satisfactory. There was no particular time when the loan was to be bought, nor was there any particular amount mentioned at any time to be purchased. Unless the defendant intended at the time he received the check fraudulently to appropriate it, he could not be convicted even on the first count. The verdict of the jury does not establish this fact. The evidence does not show conclusively that it could be established, and the same jury, upon 3 other counts, found the defendant guilty without the semblance of shadow of evidence."
How can we say that their conclusions upon the first count are unerring when they so palpably erred on the other counts? It is the opinion of the minority that the verdict of the jury in charging larceny on the first count is not valid, and that that verdict should be set aside and a new trial granted. Judge Rafalski, a meditative and yet practical man of Jewish extraction but peculiarly American appearance, felt called upon to write a third opinion, which should especially reflect his own cogitation and be a criticism on the majority as well as a slight variation from and addition to the points on which he agreed with Judge Marvin.
It was a knotty question, this, of Cowperwood's guilt, and aside from the political necessity of convicting him, nowhere was it more clearly shown than in these varying opinions of the Superior Court. Judge Rafalski held, for instance, that if a crime had been committed at all, it was not that known as larceny, and he went on to add, "It is impossible, from the evidence, to come to the conclusion either that Cowperwood did not intend shortly to deliver the loan or that Albert Stiers, the chief clerk, or the city treasurer did not intend to part not only with the possession, but also and absolutely with the property in the check and the money represented by it. It was testified by Mr. Stiers that Mr. Cowperwood said he had bought certificates of city loan to this amount, and it has not been clearly demonstrated that he had not. His non-placement of the same in the sinking fund must, in all fairness, the letter of the law to the contrary notwithstanding, be looked upon and judged in the light of custom. Was it his custom so to do? In my judgment, the doctrine now announced by the majority of the court extends the crime of constructive larceny to such limits that any businessman who engages in extensive and perfectly legitimate stock transactions may, before he knows it, by a sudden panic in the market or a fire, as in this instance, become a felon. When a principle is asserted, which establishes such a precedent, and may lead to such results, it is, to say the least, startling." While he was notably comforted by the dissenting opinions of the judges in minority, and while he had been schooling himself to expect the worst in this connection, and had been arranging his affairs as well as he could in anticipation of it, Cowperwood was still bitterly disappointed. It would be untrue to say that, strong and self-reliant as he normally was, he did not suffer. He was not without sensibilities of the highest order, only they were governed and controlled in him by that cold iron thing, his reason, which never forsook him. There was no further appeal possible save to the United States Supreme Court, as Steger pointed out, and there only on the constitutionality of some phase of the decision and his rights as a citizen, of which the Supreme Court of the United States must take cognizance. This was a tedious and expensive thing to do. It was not exactly obvious, at the moment, on what point he could make an appeal. It would involve a long delay, perhaps a year and a half, perhaps longer, at the end of which period he might have to serve his prison term anyhow, and pending which he would certainly have to undergo incarceration for a time. Cowperwood mused speculatively for a few moments after hearing Steger's presentation of the case. Then he said, "Well, it looks as if I have to go to jail or leave the country, and I've decided on jail. I can fight this out right here in Philadelphia in the long run and win. I can get that decision reversed in the Supreme Court, or I can get the governor to pardon me after a time, I think. I'm not going to run away, and everybody knows I'm not. These people who think they have me down haven't got one corner of me whipped. I'll get out of this thing after a while, and when I do, I'll show some of these petty little politicians what it means to put up a real fight. They'll never get a damn dollar out of me now. Not a dollar. I did intend to pay that $500,000 sometime if they had let me go. Now they can whistle." He set his teeth, and his gray eyes fairly snapped their determination. "Well, I've done all I can, Frank," pleaded Steger sympathetically. "You'll do me the justice to say that I put up the best fight I knew how. I may not know how. You'll have to answer for that, but within my limits I've done the best I can. I can do a few things more to carry this thing on if you want me to, but I'm going to leave it to you now. Whatever you say goes." "Don't talk nonsense at this stage, Harper," replied Cowperwood almost testily. "I know whether I'm satisfied or not, and I'd soon tell you if I wasn't. I think you might as well go on and see if you can find some definite grounds for carrying it to the Supreme Court, but meanwhile I'll begin my sentence. I suppose Paterson will be naming a day to have me brought before him now shortly." "It depends on how you'd like to have it, Frank. I could get a stay of sentence for a week, maybe, or 10 days, if it will do you any good. Shannon won't make any objection to that, I'm sure. There's only one hitch. Jaspers will be around here tomorrow looking for you. It's his duty to take you into custody again, once he's notified that your appeal has been denied."
He'll be wanting to lock you up unless you pay him, but we can fix that. If you do want to wait, and want any time off, I suppose he'll arrange to let you out with a deputy. But I'm afraid you'll have to stay there nights. They're pretty strict about that since that Albertson case of a few years ago.
Steger referred to the case of a noted bank cashier who, being let out of the county jail at night in the alleged custody of a deputy, was permitted to escape. There had been emphatic and severe condemnation of the sheriff's office at the time, and since then, repute or no repute, money or no money, convicted criminals were supposed to stay in the county jail at night at least.
Cowperwood meditated this calmly, looking out of the lawyer's window into 2nd Street.
He did not much fear anything that might happen to him in Jasper's charge since his first taste of that gentleman's hospitality, although he did object to spending nights in the county jail when his general term of imprisonment was being reduced no whit thereby.
All that he could do now in connection with his affairs, unless he could have months of freedom, could be as well adjusted from a prison cell as from his 3rd Street office. Not quite, but nearly so.
Anyhow, why parley? He was facing a prison term, and he might as well accept it without further ado. He might take a day or two, finally, to look after his affairs, but beyond that, why bother? "When, in the ordinary course of events, if you did nothing at all, would I come up for sentence?" "Oh, Friday or Monday, I fancy," replied Steger. "I don't know what move Shannon is planning to make in this matter. I thought I'd walk around and see him in a little while." "I think you'd better do that," replied Cowperwood. "Friday or Monday will suit me either way. I'm really not particular. Better make it Monday if you can. You don't suppose there's any way you can induce Jaspers to keep his hands off until then? He knows I'm perfectly responsible." "I don't know, Frank, I'm sure. I'll see. I'll go around and talk to him tonight. Perhaps $100 will make him relax the rigor of his rules that much." Cowperwood smiled grimly. "I fancy $100 would make Jaspers relax a whole lot of rules," he replied, and he got up to go. Steger arose also. "I'll see both these people, and then I'll call around at your house. You'll be in, will you, after dinner?" "Yes." They slipped on their overcoats and went out into the cold February day, Cowperwood back to his 3rd Street office, Steger to see Shannon and Jaspers. Chapter 49. The business of arranging Cowperwood's sentence for Monday was soon disposed of through Shannon, who had no personal objection to any reasonable delay. Steger next visited the county jail, close on to 5 o'clock, when it was already dark. Sheriff Jaspers came lolling out from his private library, where he had been engaged upon the work of cleaning his pipe. "How are you, Mr. Steger?" he observed, smiling blandly. "How are you? Glad to see you. Won't you sit down? I suppose you're around here again on that Cowperwood matter. I just received word from the district attorney that he had lost his case." "That's it, Sheriff," replied Steger ingratiatingly. "He asked me to step around and see what you wanted him to do in the matter. Judge Paterson has just fixed the sentence time for Monday morning at 10 o'clock. I don't suppose you'll be much put out if he doesn't show up here before Monday at 8 o'clock, will you? Or Sunday night, anyhow. He's perfectly reliable, as you know." Steger was sounding Jaspers out, politely trying to make the time of Cowperwood's arrival a trivial matter, in order to avoid paying the $100 if possible. But Jaspers was not to be so easily disposed of. His fat face lengthened considerably. How could Steger ask him such a favor and not even suggest the slightest form of remuneration? "It's again the law, Mr. Steger, as you know," he began, cautiously and complainingly. "I'd like to accommodate him, everything else being equal, but since that Albertson case 3 years ago, we've had to run this office much more carefully."
"Oh, I know, Sheriff," interrupted Steger blandly, "but this isn't an ordinary case in any way, as you can see for yourself. Mr. Cowperwood is a very important man, and he has a great many things to attend to."
Now, if it were only a mere matter of $75 or $100 to satisfy some court clerk with, or to pay a fine, it would be easy enough, but— He paused and looked wisely away, and Mr. Jasper's face began to relax at once. The law against which it was ordinarily so hard to offend was not now so important. Steger saw that it was needless to introduce any additional arguments. "It's a very ticklish business, this, Mr. Steger," put in the sheriff yieldingly, and yet with a slight whimper in his voice. "If anything were to happen, it would cost me my place, all right. I don't like to do it under any circumstances, and I wouldn't, only I happen to know both Mr. Cowperwood and Mr. Stenner, and I like 'em both. I don't think they got their rights in this matter, either. I don't mind making an exception in this case if Mr. Cowperwood don't go about too publicly. I wouldn't want any of the men in the district attorney's office to know this. I don't suppose you'll mind if I keep a deputy somewhere near all the time for look's sake. I have to, you know, really, under the law. If you won't bother him any, just keep on guard like." Jaspers looked at Mr. Steger very flatly and wisely, almost placatingly under the circumstances, and Steger nodded. "Quite right, Sheriff, quite right. You're quite right." And he drew out his purse while the sheriff led the way very cautiously back into his library. "I'd like to show you the line of law books I'm fixing up for myself in here, Mr. Steger," he observed genially, but meanwhile closing his fingers gently on the small roll of $10 bills Steger was handing him. "We have occasional useful books of that kind here, as you see. I thought it a good sort of thing to have them around." He waved one arm comprehensively at the line of state reports, revised statutes, prison regulations, etc., the while he put the money in his pocket, and Steger pretended to look. "A good idea, I think, Sheriff. Very good indeed. So you think if Mr. Cowperwood gets around here very early Monday morning, say 8 or 8:30, that it will be all right?" "I think so," replied the sheriff, curiously nervous, but agreeable, anxious to please. "I don't think that anything will come up that will make me want him earlier. If it does, I'll let you know, and you can produce him. I don't think so, though, Mr. Steger. I think everything will be all right." They were once more in the main hall now. "Glad to have seen you again, Mr. Steger. Very glad," he added. "Call again some day." Waving the sheriff a pleasant farewell, he hurried on his way to Cowperwood's house. You would not have thought, seeing Cowperwood mount the front steps of his handsome residence in his neat gray suit and well-cut overcoat on his return from his office that evening, that he was thinking that this might be his last night here. His air and walk indicated no weakening of spirit. He entered the hall, where an early lamp was aglow, and encountered Wash Sims, an old Negro factotum, who was just coming up from the basement, carrying a bucket of coal for one of the fireplaces. "Mighty cold out this evening, Mr. Cowperwood," said Wash, to whom anything less than 60 degrees was very cold. His one regret was that Philadelphia was not located in North Carolina, from whence he came. "'Tis sharp, Wash," replied Cowperwood absent-mindedly. He was thinking for the moment of the house and how it had looked, as he came toward it west along Girard Avenue, what the neighbors were thinking of him, too, observing him from time to time out of their windows. It was clear and cold. The lamps in the reception-room and sitting-room had been lit, for he had permitted no air of funereal gloom to settle down over this place since his troubles had begun. In the far west of the street, a last tingling gleam of lavender and violet was showing over the cold white snow of the roadway. The house of gray-green stone, with its lighted windows and cream-colored lace curtains, had looked especially attractive. He had thought for the moment of the pride he had taken in putting all this here, decorating and ornamenting it, and whether ever he could secure it for himself again. "Where is your mistress?" he added to Wash, when he bethought himself. "In the sitting-room, Mr. Cowperwood, I think." Cowperwood ascended the stairs, thinking curiously that Wash would soon be out of a job now, unless Mrs. Cowperwood, out of all the wreck of other things, chose to retain him, which was not likely. He entered the sitting-room, and there sat his wife by the oblong center table, sewing a hook and eye on one of Lillian Second's petticoats. She looked up at his step, with the peculiarly uncertain smile she used these days, indication of her pain, fear, suspicion, and inquired, "Well, what is new with you, Frank?" Her smile was something like a hat or belt or ornament, which one puts on or off at will. "Nothing in particular," he replied in his offhand way, "except that I understand I have lost that appeal of mine. Steger is coming here in a little while to let me know. I had a note from him, and I fancy it's about that." He did not care to say squarely that he had lost. He knew that she was sufficiently distressed, as it was, and he did not care to be too abrupt just now. "You don't say," replied Lillian, with surprise and fright in her voice, and getting up. She had been so used to a world where prisons were scarcely thought of, where things went on smoothly from day to day without any noticeable intrusion of such distressing things as courts, jails, and the like, that these last few months had driven her nearly mad. Cowperwood had so definitely insisted on her keeping in the background. He had told her so very little that she was all at sea anyhow in regard to the whole procedure. Nearly all that she had in the way of intelligence, had been most from his father and mother and Anna, and from a close and almost secret scrutiny of the newspapers. At the time he had gone out to the county jail, she did not even know anything about it until his father had come back from the courtroom and the jail and had broken the news to her. It had been a terrific blow to her. Now, to have this thing suddenly broken to her in this offhand way, even though she had been expecting and dreading it hourly, was too much. She was still a decidedly charming-looking woman as she stood holding her daughter's garment in her hand, even if she was 40 years old to Cowperwood's 35. She was robed in one of the creations of their late prosperity, a cream-colored gown of rich silk, with dark brown trimmings, a fetching combination for her. Her eyes were a little hollow and reddish about the rims, but otherwise she showed no sign of her keen mental distress. There was considerable evidence of the former tranquil sweetness that had so fascinated him 10 years before. "Isn't that terrible?" she said weakly, her hands trembling in a nervous way. "Isn't it dreadful? Isn't there anything more you can do, truly? You won't really have to go to prison, will you?" He objected to her distress and her nervous fears. He preferred a stronger, more self-reliant type of woman, but still she was his wife, and in his day he had loved her much. "It looks that way, Lillian," he said, with the first note of real sympathy he had used in a long while, for he felt sorry for her now. At the same time he was afraid to go any further along that line, for fear it might give her a false sense as to his present attitude toward her, which was one essentially of indifference. But she was not so dull but what she could see that the consideration in his voice had been brought about by his defeat, which meant hers also. She choked a little, and even so was touched. The bare suggestion of sympathy brought back the old days so definitely gone forever. If only they could be brought back. "I don't want you to feel distressed about me, though," he went on before she could say anything to him. "I'm not through with my fighting. I'll get out of this. I have to go to prison, it seems, in order to get things straightened out properly. What I would like you to do is to keep up a cheerful appearance in front of the rest of the family, father and mother particularly. They need to be cheered up." He thought once of taking her hand, then decided not. She noted mentally his hesitation, the great difference between his attitude now and that of 10 or 12 years before. It did not hurt her now as much as she once would have thought. She looked at him, scarcely knowing what to say. There was really not so much to say. "Will you have to go soon, if you do have to go?" she ventured wearily. "I can't tell yet. Possibly tonight, possibly Friday, possibly not until Monday. I'm waiting to hear from Steger. I expect him here any minute." To prison. To prison. Her Frank Cowperwood. Her husband. The substance of their home here, and all their soul destruction going to prison. And even now she scarcely grasped why. She stood there wondering what she could do. "Is there anything I can get for you?" she asked, starting forward, as if out of a dream. "Do you want me to do anything? Don't you think perhaps you had better leave Philadelphia, Frank? You needn't go to prison unless you want to." She was a little beside herself, for the first time in her life, shocked out of a deadly calm. He paused and looked at her for a moment in his direct, examining way, his hard commercial business judgment restored on the instant. "That would be a confession of guilt, Lillian, and I'm not guilty," he replied almost coldly. "I haven't done anything that warrants my running away, or going to prison either. I'm merely going there to save time at present. I can't be litigating this thing forever. I'll get out, be pardoned out, or sued out in a reasonable length of time. Just now it's better to go, I think. I wouldn't think of running away from Philadelphia. 2 of 5 judges found for me in the decision. That's pretty fair evidence that the state has no case against me." His wife saw that she had made a mistake. It clarified her judgment on the instant. "I didn't mean it that way, Frank," she replied apologetically. "You know I didn't. Of course I know you're not guilty. Why should I think you were, of all people?" She paused, expecting some retort, some further argument, a kind word, maybe, a trace of the older, baffling love, but he had quietly turned to his desk and was thinking of other things. At this point the anomaly of her own state came over her again. It was all so sad and so hopeless, and what was she to do in the future? And what was he likely to do? She paused, half trembling, and yet decided, because of her peculiarly non-resisting nature, why trespass on his time? Why bother? No good would really come of it. He really did not care for her any more. That was it. Nothing could make him, nothing could bring them together again, not even this tragedy. He was interested in another woman, Eileen, and so her foolish thoughts and explanations, her fear, sorrow, distress, were not important to him. He could take her agonized wish for his freedom as a comment on his probable guilt, a doubt of his innocence, a criticism of him. She turned away for a minute, and he started to leave the room. "I'll be back again in a few moments," he volunteered. "Are the children here?" "Yes, they're up in the playroom," she answered sadly, utterly nonplussed and distraught. "Oh, Frank!" She had it on her lips to cry, but before she could utter it, he had bustled down the steps and was gone. She turned back to the table, her left hand to her mouth, her eyes in a queer, hazy, melancholy mist. Could it be, she thought, that life could really come to this? That love could so utterly, so thoroughly die? 10 years before, but oh, why go back to that? Obviously it could, and thoughts concerning that would not help now. Twice now in her life her affairs had seemed to go to pieces, once when her first husband had died, and now when her second had failed her, had fallen in love with another, and was going to be sent off to prison. What was it about her that caused such things? Was there anything wrong with her? What was she going to do? Where go? She had no idea, of course, for how long a term of years he would be sent away. It might be 1 year, or it might be 5 years, as the papers had said. Good heavens! The children could almost come to forget him in 5 years. She put her other hand to her mouth, also, and then to her forehead, where there was a dull ache. She tried to think further than this, but somehow, just now, there was no further thought. Suddenly, quite outside of her own volition, with no thought that she was going to do such a thing, her bosom began to heave. Her throat contracted in 4 or 5 short, sharp, aching spasms. Her eyes burned, and she shook in a vigorous, anguished, desperate, almost one might have said dry-eyed cry, so hot and few were the tears. She could not stop for the moment, just stood there and shook, and then after a while a dull ache succeeded, and she was quite as she had been before. Why cry? She suddenly asked herself, fiercely, for her. Why break down in this stormy, useless way? Would it help? But in spite of her speculative, philosophic observations to herself, she still felt the echo, the distant rumble, as it were, of the storm in her own soul. Why cry? Why not cry? She might have said, but wouldn't, and in spite of herself and all her logic, she knew that this tempest, which had so recently raged over her, was now merely circling around her soul's horizon, and would return to break again. Chapter 50. The arrival of Steger with the information that no move of any kind would be made by the sheriff until Monday morning, when Cowperwood could present himself, eased matters. This gave him time to think, to adjust home details at his leisure. He broke the news to his father and mother in a consoling way, and talked with his brothers and father about getting matters immediately adjusted in connection with the smaller houses to which they were now shortly to be compelled to move. There was much conferring among the different members of this collapsing organization in regard to the minor details, and what with his conferences with Steger, his seeing personally Davison, Lee, Avery Stone of Tighe Company, George Waterman, his old-time employer Henry was dead, ex-State Treasurer Van Nostrand, who had gone out with the last state administration, and others, he was very busy. Now that he was really going into prison, he wanted his financial friends to get together and see if they could get him out by appealing to the governor. The division of opinion among the judges of the State Supreme Court was his excuse and strong point. He wanted Steger to follow this up, and he spared no pains in trying to see all and sundry who might be of use to him. Edward Tighe of Tighe Company, who was still in business in 3rd Street, Newton Targool, Arthur Rivers, Joseph Zimmerman, the dry goods prince, now a millionaire, Judge Kitchen, Terence Relihan, the former representative of the money element at Harrisburg, and many others. Cowperwood wanted Relihan to approach the newspapers and see if he could not readjust their attitude so as to work to get him out, and he wanted Walter Lee to head the movement of getting up a signed petition, which should contain all the important names of moneyed people and others, asking the governor to release him. Lee agreed to this heartily, as did Relihan and many others. And afterwards there was really nothing else to do, unless it was to see Eileen once more, and this, in the midst of his other complications and obligations, seemed all but impossible at times. And yet he did achieve that, too. So eager was he to be soothed and comforted by the ignorant, and yet all-embracing volume of her love. Her eyes these days, the eager, burning quest of him and his happiness that blazed in them. To think that he should be tortured so, her Frank. Oh, she knew, whatever he said and however bravely and jauntily he talked. To think that her love for him should have been the principal cause of his being sent to jail, as she now believed, and the cruelty of her father, and the smallness of his enemies, that fool Stenner, for instance, whose pictures he had seen in the papers, Actually, whenever in the presence of her Frank, she fairly seethed in a chemic agony for him, her strong, handsome lover, the strongest, bravest, wisest, kindest, handsomest man in the world. Oh, didn't she know? And Cowperwood, looking in her eyes and realizing this reasonless, if so comforting fever for him, smiled and was touched. Such love! That of a dog for a master, that of a mother for a child. And how had he come to evoke it? He could not say, but it was beautiful. And so now, in these last trying hours, he wished to see her much, and did, meeting her at least 4 times in the month in which he had been free, between his conviction and the final dismissal of his appeal. He had one last opportunity of seeing her, and she him, just before his entrance into prison this last time, on the Saturday before the Monday of his sentence. He had not come in contact with her since the decision of the Supreme Court had been rendered, but he had had a letter from her sent to a private mailbox, and had made an appointment for Saturday at a small hotel in Camden, which, being across the river, was safer in his judgment than anything in Philadelphia. He was a little uncertain as to how she would take the possibility of not seeing him soon again after Monday, and how she would act generally once he was where she could not confer with him as often as she chose. And in consequence, he was anxious to talk to her. But on this occasion, as he anticipated, and even feared, so sorry for her was he, she was not less emphatic in her protestations than she had ever been, in fact, much more so. When she saw him approaching in the distance, she went forward to meet him in that direct, forceful way which only she could attempt with him, a sort of mannish impetuosity, which he both enjoyed and admired, and slipping her arms around his neck, said, "Honey, you needn't tell me. I saw it in the papers the other morning. Don't you mind, honey. I love you. I'll wait for you. I'll be with you yet, if it takes 12 years of waiting. It doesn't make any difference to me if it takes 100, only I'm so sorry for you, sweetheart. I'll be with you every day through this, darling, loving you with all my might." She caressed him while he looked at her in that quiet way which betokened at once his self-poise and yet his interest and satisfaction in her. He couldn't help loving Eileen, he thought. Who could? She was so passionate, vibrant, desireful. He couldn't help admiring her tremendously, now more than ever, because literally, in spite of all his intellectual strength, he really could not rule her. She went at him, even when he stood off in a calm, critical way, as if he were her special property, her toy. She would talk to him always, and particularly when she was excited, as if he was just a baby, her pet. And sometimes he felt as though she would really overcome him mentally, make him subservient to her. She was so individual, so sure of her importance as a woman. Now on this occasion she went babbling on as if he were broken-hearted, in need of her greatest care and tenderness, although he really wasn't at all, and for the moment she actually made him feel as though he was. "It isn't as bad as that, Eileen," he ventured to say eventually, and with a softness and tenderness almost unusual for him, even where she was concerned, but she went on forcefully, paying no heed to him. "Oh, yes, it is, too, honey. I know. Oh, my poor Frank. But I'll see you. I know how to manage, whatever happens. How often do they let visitors come out to see the prisoners there?" "Only once in 3 months, pet. So they say, but I think we can fix that after I get there. Only do you think you had better try to come right away, Eileen? You know what the feeling now is. Hadn't you better wait a while? Aren't you in danger of stirring up your father? He might cause a lot of trouble out there if you were so minded." "Only once in 3 months!" she exclaimed, with rising emphasis, as he began this explanation. "Oh, Frank, no! Surely not! Once in 3 months! Oh, I can't stand that! I won't! I'll go and see the warden myself. He'll let me see you. I'm sure he will, if I talk to him." She fairly gasped in her excitement, not willing to pause in her tirade, but Cowperwood interposed with her. "You're not thinking what you're saying, Eileen. You're not thinking. Remember your father? Remember your family? Your father may know the warden out there. You don't want it to get all over town that you're running out there to see me, do you? Your father might cause you trouble. Besides, you don't know the small-party politicians as I do. They gossip like a lot of old women. You'll have to be very careful what you do and how you do it. I don't want to lose you. I want to see you. But you'll have to mind what you're doing. Don't try to see me at once. I want you to, but I want to find out how the land lies, and I want you to find out, too. You won't lose me. I'll be there well enough." He paused as he thought of the long tier of iron cells which must be there, one of which would be his. For how long? And of Eileen seeing him through the door of it, or in it. At the same time he was thinking, in spite of all his other calculations, how charming she was looking today, how young she kept, and how forceful. While he was nearing his full maturity, she was a comparatively young girl, and as beautiful as ever. She was wearing a black and white striped silk in the curious bustle style of the times, and a set of sealskin furs, including a little sealskin cap set jauntily on top of her red-gold hair. "I know," replied Eileen firmly. "But think of 3 months. Honey, I can't. I won't. It's nonsense. 3 months. I know that my father wouldn't have to wait any 3 months if he wanted to see anybody out there, nor anybody else that he wanted to ask favors for, and I won't either. I'll find some way." Cowperwood had to smile. You could not defeat Eileen so easily. "But you're not your father, honey, and you don't want him to know." "I know I don't, but they don't need to know who I am. I can go heavily veiled. I don't think that the warden knows my father. Well, he may. Anyhow, he doesn't know me, and he wouldn't tell on me if he did, if I talked to him." Her confidence in her charms, her personality, her earthly privileges was quite anarchistic. Cowperwood shook his head. "Honey, you're about the best and the worst there is when it comes to a woman," he observed affectionately, pulling her head down to kiss her. "But you'll have to listen to me just the same. I have a lawyer, Steger. You know him. He's going to take up this matter with the warden out there. He's doing it today. He may be able to fix things, and he may not. I'll know tomorrow or Sunday, and I'll write you. But don't go and do anything rash until you hear. I'm sure I can cut that visiting limit in half, and perhaps down to once a month or once in 2 weeks even. They only allow me to write 1 letter in 3 months. Eileen exploded again. "And I'm sure I can have that made different. Some. But don't write me until you hear, or at least don't sign any name or put any address in. They open all mail and read it. If you see me or write me, you'll have to be cautious, and you're not the most cautious person in the world. Now be good, will you?" They talked much more. Of his family, his court appearance Monday, whether he would get out soon to attend any of the suits still pending, or be pardoned. Eileen still believed in his future. She had read the opinions of the dissenting judges in his favor, and that of the 3 agreed judges against him. She was sure his day was not over in Philadelphia, and that he would someday re-establish himself and then take her with him somewhere else. She was sorry for Mrs. Cowperwood, but she was convinced that she was not suited to him, that Frank needed someone more like herself, someone with youth and beauty and force, her no less. She clung to him now in ecstatic embraces until it was time to go. So far as a plan of procedure could have been adjusted in a situation so incapable of accurate adjustment, it had been done. She was desperately downcast at the last moment, as was he, over their parting. But she pulled herself together with her usual force and faced the dark future with a steady eye. Chapter 51. Monday came, and with it his final departure. All that could be done had been done. Cowperwood said his farewells to his mother and father, his brothers and sister. He had a rather distant but sensible and matter-of-fact talk with his wife. He made no special point of saying goodbye to his son or his daughter. When he came in on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday evenings, after he had learned that he was to depart Monday, it was with the thought of talking to them a little in an especially affectionate way. He realized that his general moral or unmoral attitude was perhaps working them a temporary injustice. Still, he was not sure. Most people did fairly well with their lives, whether coddled or deprived of opportunity. These children would probably do as well as most children, whatever happened. And then, anyhow, he had no intention of forsaking them financially, if he could help it. He did not want to separate his wife from her children, nor them from her. She should keep them. He wanted them to be comfortable with her. He would like to see them, wherever they were with her, occasionally. Only he wanted his own personal freedom, insofar as she and they were concerned, to go off and set up a new world and a new home with Eileen. So now, on these last days, and particularly this last Sunday night, he was rather noticeably considerate of his boy and girl, without being too openly indicative of his approaching separation from them. "Frank," he said to his notably lackadaisical son on this occasion, "aren't you going to straighten up and be a big, strong, healthy fellow? You don't play enough. You ought to get in with a gang of boys and be a leader. Why don't you fit yourself up a gymnasium somewhere and see how strong you can get?" They were in the senior Cowperwood sitting room, where they had all rather consciously gathered on this occasion. Lillian, second, who was on the other side of the big library table from her father, paused to survey him and her brother with interest. Both had been carefully guarded against any real knowledge of their father's affairs or his present predicament. He was going away on a journey for about a month, or so they understood. Lillian was reading in a chatterbox book, which had been given her the previous Christmas. "He won't do anything," she volunteered, looking up from her reading in a peculiarly critical way for her. "Why, he won't ever run races with me when I want him to." "Oh, who wants to run races with you anyhow?" returned Frank Jr. sourly. "You couldn't run if I did want to run with you." "Couldn't I?" she replied. "I could beat you all right." "Lillian," pleaded her mother, with a warning sound in her voice. Cowperwood smiled and laid his hand affectionately on his son's head. "You'll be all right, Frank," he volunteered, pinching his ear lightly. "Don't worry. Just make an effort." The boy did not respond as warmly as he hoped. Later in the evening, Mrs. Cowperwood noticed that her husband squeezed his daughter's slim little waist and pulled her curly hair gently. For the moment she was jealous of her daughter. "Going to be the best kind of a girl while I'm away?" he said to her privately. "Yes, Papa," she replied brightly. "That's right," he returned, and leaned over and kissed her mouth tenderly. "Button eyes," he said. Mrs. Cowperwood sighed after he had gone. "Everything for the children, nothing for me," she thought, though the children had not got so vastly much either in the past. Cowperwood's attitude toward his mother in this final hour was about as tender and sympathetic as any he could maintain in this world. He understood quite clearly the ramifications of her interests, and how she was suffering for him and all the others concerned. He had not forgotten her sympathetic care of him in his youth, and if he could have done anything to have spared her this unhappy breakdown of her fortunes in her old age, he would have done so. There was no use crying over spilled milk. It was impossible at times for him not to feel intensely in moments of success or failure. But the proper thing to do was to bear up, not to show it, to talk little and go your way, with an air not so much of resignation as of self-sufficiency, to whatever was awaiting you. That was his attitude on this morning, and that was what he expected from those around him, almost compelled, in fact, by his own attitude. "Well, Mother," he said genially, at the last moment. He would not let her, nor his wife, nor his sister come to court, maintaining that it would make not the least difference to him, and would only harrow their own feelings uselessly. "I'm going now. Don't worry. Keep up your spirits." He slipped his arm around his mother's waist, and she gave him a long, unrestrained, despairing embrace and kiss. "Go on, Frank," she said, choking, when she let him go. "God bless you. I'll pray for you." He paid no further attention to her. He didn't dare. "Goodbye, Lillian," he said to his wife, pleasantly, kindly. "I'll be back in a few days, I think. I'll be coming out to attend some of these court proceedings." To his sister he said, "Goodbye, Anna. Don't let the others get too downhearted." "I'll see you three afterward," he said to his father and brothers, and so, dressed in the very best fashion of the time, he hurried down into the reception hall, where Steger was waiting and was off. His family, hearing the door close on him, suffered a poignant sense of desolation. They stood there for a moment, his mother crying, his father looking as though he had lost his last friend, but making a great effort to seem self-contained and equal to his troubles, Anna telling Lillian not to mind, and the latter staring dumbly into the future, not knowing what to think. Surely a brilliant sun had set on their local scene, and in a very pathetic way. Chapter 52. When Cowperwood reached the jail, Jaspers was there, glad to see him, but principally relieved to feel that nothing had happened to mar his own reputation as a sheriff. Because of the urgency of court matters generally, it was decided to depart for the courtroom at 9 o'clock. Eddie Zanders was once more delegated to see that Cowperwood was brought safely before Judge Paterson, and afterward taken to the penitentiary. All of the papers in the case were put in his care to be delivered to the warden. "I suppose you know," confided Sheriff Jaspers to Steger, "that Stenner is here. He ain't got no money now, but I gave him a private room just the same. I didn't want to put a man like him in no cell." Sheriff Jaspers sympathized with Stenner. "Well, that's right. I'm glad to hear that," replied Steger, smiling to himself. "I didn't suppose from what I've heard that Mr. Cowperwood would want to meet Stenner here, so I've kept him apart. George just left a minute ago with another deputy." "That's good. That's the way it ought to be," replied Steger. He was glad for Cowperwood's sake that the sheriff had so much tact. Evidently George and the sheriff were getting along in a very friendly way, for all the former's bitter troubles and lack of means. The Cowperwood party walked, the distance not being great, and as they did so, they talked of rather simple things to avoid the more serious. "Things aren't going to be so bad," Edward said to his father. "Steger says the governor is sure to pardon Stenner in a year or less, and if he does, he's bound to let Frank out, too." Cowperwood the elder had heard this over and over, but he was never tired of hearing it. It was like some simple croon with which babies are hushed to sleep. The snow on the ground, which was enduring remarkably well for this time of year, the fineness of the day, which had started out to be clear and bright, the hope that the courtroom might not be full, all held the attention of the father and his two sons. Cowperwood Sr. even commented on some sparrows fighting over a piece of bread, marveling how well they did in winter, solely to ease his mind. Cowperwood, walking on ahead with Steger and Zanders, talked of approaching court proceedings in connection with his business and what ought to be done. When they reached the court, the same little pen in which Cowperwood had awaited the verdict of his jury several months before was awaiting to receive him. Cowperwood Sr. and his other sons sought places in the courtroom proper. Eddie Zanders remained with his charge. Stenner and the deputy by the name of Wilkerson were in the room, but he and Cowperwood pretended now not to see each other. Frank had no objection to talking to his former associate, but he could see that Stenner was diffident and ashamed. So he let the situation pass without look or word of any kind. After some 3/4 of an hour of dreary waiting, the door leading into the courtroom proper opened, and a bailiff stepped in. "All prisoners up for sentence," he called. There were 6 all told, including Cowperwood and Stenner. 2 of them were Confederate housebreakers who had been caught red-handed at their midnight task. Another prisoner was no more or no less than a plain horse thief, a young man of 26, who had been convicted by a jury of stealing a grocer's horse and selling it. The last man was a Negro, a tall, shambling, illiterate, nebulous-minded black, who had walked off with an apparently discarded section of lead pipe which he had found in a lumber yard. His idea was to sell or trade it for a drink. He really did not belong in this court at all, but having been caught by an undersized American watchman charged with the care of the property, and having at first refused to plead guilty, not quite understanding what was to be done with him, he had been perforce bound over to this court for trial. Afterward, he had changed his mind and admitted his guilt, so he now had to come before Judge Paterson for sentence or dismissal. The lower court before, which he had originally been brought, had lost jurisdiction by binding him over to the higher court for trial. Eddie Zanders, in his self-appointed position as guide and mentor to Cowperwood, had confided nearly all of this data to him as he stood waiting. The courtroom was crowded. It was very humiliating to Cowperwood to have to file in this way along the side aisle with these others, followed by Stenner, well-dressed but sickly-looking and disconsolate. The Negro, Charles Ackerman, was the first on the list. "How is it this man comes before me?" asked Paterson peevishly, when he noted the value of the property Ackerman was supposed to have stolen. "Your Honor," the assistant district attorney explained promptly, "this man was before a lower court and refused, because he was drunk or something, to plead guilty. The lower court, because the complainant would not forego the charge, was compelled to bind him over to this court for trial. Since then he has changed his mind and has admitted his guilt to the district attorney. He would not be brought before you except we have no alternative. He has to be brought here now in order to clear the calendar." Judge Paterson stared quizzically at the Negro, who, obviously not very much disturbed by this examination, was leaning comfortably on the gate or bar before which the average criminal stood erect and terrified. He had been before police court magistrates before, on one charge and another, drunkenness, disorderly conduct, and the like, but his whole attitude was one of shambling, lackadaisical, amusing innocence. "Well, Ackerman," inquired His Honor severely, "did you or did you not steal this piece of lead pipe as charged here, $4.80 worth?" "Yes, sir, I did," he began. "I'll tell you how it was, Judge. I was a-comin' along past that lumber yard one Saturday afternoon, and I hadn't been looking, and I saw that piece of pipe through the fence lying inside, and I just reached through with a piece of board I found there and pulled it over to me and tuck it. And afterward, this Mr. Watchman man," he waved his hand oratorically toward the witness chair, where, in case the judge might wish to ask him some questions, the complainant had taken his stand, "come around to where I live and accused me of done taking it." "But you did take it, didn't you?" "Yes, sir, I done took it." "What did you do with it?" "I traded it for 25 cents. "You mean you sold it," corrected His Honor. "Yes, sir, I done sold it." "Well, don't you know it's wrong to do anything like that? Didn't you know when you reached through that fence and pulled that pipe over to you that you were stealing, didn't you?" "Yes, sir, I knowed it was wrong," replied Ackerman sheepishly. "I didn't think 'twas stealing like exactly, but I done knowed it was wrong. I done knowed I oughtn't take it, I guess." "Of course you did. Of course you did. That's just it. You knew you were stealing, and still you took it. Has the man to whom this Negro sold the lead pipe been apprehended yet?" the judge inquired sharply of the district attorney. "He should be, for he's more guilty than this Negro, a receiver of stolen goods." "Yes, sir," replied the assistant. "His case is before Judge Yager." "Quite right, it should be," replied Paterson severely. "This matter of receiving stolen property is one of the worst offenses, in my judgment." He then turned his attention to Ackerman again. "Now look here, Ackerman," he exclaimed, irritated at having to bother with such a petty case. "I want to say something to you, and I want you to pay strict attention to me. Straighten up there. Don't lean on that gate. You are in the presence of the law now." Ackerman had sprawled himself comfortably down on his elbows, as he would have if he had been leaning over a back fence gate, talking to someone, but he immediately drew himself straight, still grinning foolishly and apologetically when he heard this. "You are not so dull but that you can understand what I am going to say to you. The offense you have committed, stealing a piece of lead pipe, is a crime. Do you hear me? A criminal offense. One that I could punish you very severely for. I could send you to the penitentiary for 1 year if I chose. The law says I may. 1 year at hard labor for stealing a piece of lead pipe. Now, if you have any sense, you will pay strict attention to what I am going to tell you. I am not going to send you to the penitentiary right now. I'm going to wait a little while. I am going to sentence you to 1 year in the penitentiary. 1 year. Do you understand?" Ackerman blanched a little and licked his lips nervously. "And then I am going to suspend that sentence, hold it over your head, so that if you are ever caught taking anything else, you will be punished for this offense and the next one also at one and the same time. Do you understand that? Do you know what I mean? Tell me. Do you?" "Yes, sir, I does, sir," replied the Negro. "You's going to let me go now. That's it." The audience grinned, and His Honor made a wry face to prevent his own grim grin. "I'm going to let you go only so long as you don't steal anything else," he thundered. "The moment you steal anything else, back you come to this court, and then you go to the penitentiary for a year, and whatever more time you deserve. Do you understand that? Now, I want you to walk straight out of this court and behave yourself. Don't ever steal anything. Get something to do. Don't steal, do you hear? Don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you. Don't come back here. If you do, I'll send you to the penitentiary, sure." "Yes, sir. No, sir, I won't," replied Ackerman nervously. "I won't take nothing more that don't belong to me." He shuffled away after a moment, urged along by the guiding hand of a bailiff, and was put safely outside the court, amid a mixture of smiles and laughter over his simplicity and Paterson's undue severity of manner. But the next case was called and soon engrossed the interest of the audience. It was that of the 2 housebreakers whom Cowperwood had been and was still studying with much curiosity. In all his life before, he had never witnessed a sentencing scene of any kind. He had never been in police or criminal courts of any kind, rarely in any of the civil ones. He was glad to see the Negro go, and gave Paterson credit for having some sense and sympathy, more than he had expected. He wondered now whether by any chance Eileen was here. He had objected to her coming, but she might have done so. She was, as a matter of fact, in the extreme rear, pocketed in a crowd near the door, heavily veiled but present. She had not been able to resist the desire to know quickly and surely her beloved's fate, to be near him in his hour of real suffering, as she thought. She was greatly angered at seeing him brought in with a line of ordinary criminals made to wait in this, to her, shameful public manner, but she could not help admiring all the more the dignity and superiority of his presence even here. He was not even pale, as she saw, just the same firm, calm soul she had always known him to be. If he could only see her now, if he would only look so she could lift her veil and smile. He didn't, though. He wouldn't. He didn't want to see her here, but she would tell him all about it when she saw him again just the same. The 2 burglars were quickly disposed of by the judge with a sentence of 1 year each, and they were led away, uncertain and apparently not knowing what to think of their crime or their future. When it came to Cowperwood's turn to be called, His Honor himself stiffened and straightened up, for this was a different type of man, and could not be handled in the usual manner. He knew exactly what he was going to say. When one of Mollenhauer's agents, a close friend of Butler's, had suggested that 5 years for both Cowperwood and Stenner would be about right, he knew exactly what to do. "Frank Algernon Cowperwood," called the clerk. Cowperwood stepped briskly forward, sorry for himself, ashamed of his position in a way, but showing it neither in look nor manner. Paterson eyed him as he had the others. "Name?" asked the bailiff, for the benefit of the court stenographer. "Frank Algernon Cowperwood." "Residence?" 1937 Girard Avenue. "Occupation?" "Banker and broker." Steger stood close beside him, very dignified, very forceful, ready to make a final statement for the benefit of the court and the public when the time should come. Eileen, from her position in the crowd near the door, was for the first time in her life biting her fingers nervously, and there were great beads of perspiration on her brow. Cowperwood's father was tense with excitement, and his 2 brothers looked quickly away, doing their best to hide their fear and sorrow. "Ever convicted before?" "Never," replied Steger for Cowperwood quietly. "Frank Algernon Cowperwood," called the clerk in his nasal sing-song way, coming forward. "Have you anything to say why judgment should not now be pronounced upon you? If so, speak." Cowperwood started to say no, but Steger put up his hand. "If the court pleases my client, Mr. Cowperwood, the prisoner at the bar, is neither guilty in his own estimation, nor in that of 2/5 of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, the court of last resort in this state," he exclaimed loudly and clearly, so that all might hear. One of the interested listeners and spectators at this point was Edward Malia Butler, who had just stepped in from another courtroom, where he had been talking to a judge. An obsequious court attendant had warned him that Cowperwood was about to be sentenced. He had really come here this morning in order not to miss this sentence, but he cloaked his motive under the guise of another errand. He did not know that Eileen was there, nor did he see her. "As he himself testified at the time of his trial," went on Steger, "and as the evidence clearly showed, he was never more than an agent for the gentleman whose offense was subsequently adjudicated by this court. And as an agent, he still maintains, and 2/5 of the state Supreme Court agree with him, that he was strictly within his rights and privileges in not having deposited the $60,000 worth of city loan certificates at the time, and in the manner which the people, acting through the district attorney, complained that he should have. My client is a man of rare financial ability. By the various letters which have been submitted to your honor in his behalf, you will see that he commands the respect and the sympathy of a large majority of the most forceful and eminent men in his particular world. He is a man of distinguished social standing and of notable achievements. Only the most unheralded and the unkindest thrust of fortune has brought him here before you today. A fire, and its consequent panic, which involved a financial property of the most thorough and stable character. In spite of the verdict of the jury and the decision of 3/5 of the state Supreme Court, I maintain that my client is not an embezzler, that he has not committed larceny, that he should never have been convicted, and that he should not now be punished for something of which he is not guilty. I trust that your honor will not misunderstand me or my motives when I point out in this situation that what I have said is true. I do not wish to cast any reflection on the integrity of the court, nor of any of the processes of law. But I do condemn and deplore the untoward chain of events which has built up a seeming situation not easily understood by the lay mind, and which has brought my distinguished client within the purview of the law. I think it is but fair that this should be finally and publicly stated here and now.
I ask that your honor be lenient, and that if you cannot conscientiously dismiss this charge, you will at least see that the facts, as I have indicated them, are given due weight in a measure of the punishment inflicted."
Steger stepped back, and Judge Paterson nodded, as much as to say he had heard all the distinguished lawyer had to say, and would give it such consideration as it deserved, no more. Then he turned to Cowperwood, and, summoning all his judicial dignity to his aid, he began, "Frank Algernon Cowperwood, you have been convicted by a jury of your own selection of the offense of larceny. The motion for a new trial, made in your behalf by your learned counsel, has been carefully considered and overruled, the majority of the court being entirely satisfied with the propriety of the conviction, both upon the law and the evidence. Your offense was one of more than usual gravity, the more so that the large amount of money which you obtained belonged to the city, and it was aggravated by the fact that you had in addition thereto unlawfully used and converted to your own use several $100,000 of the loan and money of the city. For such an offense, the maximum punishment affixed by the law is singularly merciful. Nevertheless, the facts in connection with your hitherto distinguished position, the circumstances under which your failure was brought about, and the appeals of your numerous friends and financial associates will be given due consideration by this court. It is not unmindful of any important fact in your career." Paterson paused as if in doubt, though he knew very well how he was about to proceed. He knew what his superiors expected of him. "If your case points no other moral," he went on after a moment, toying with the briefs, "it will be at least teach the lesson much needed at the present time, that the treasury of the city is not to be invaded and plundered with impunity under the thin disguise of a business transaction, and that there is still a power in the law to vindicate itself and to protect the public. The sentence of the court," he added solemnly, the while Cowperwood gazed unmoved, "is, therefore, that you pay a fine of $5,000 to the Commonwealth for the use of the county, that you pay the costs of prosecution, and that you undergo imprisonment in the state penitentiary for the Eastern District by separate or solitary confinement at labor for a period of 4 years and 3 months, and that you stand committed until this sentence is complied with." Cowperwood's father, on hearing this, bowed his head to hide his tears. Eileen bit her lower lip and clenched her hands to keep down her rage and disappointment and tears. 4 years and 3 months. That would make a terrible gap in his life and hers. Still, she could wait. It was better than 8 or 10 years, as she had feared it might be. Perhaps now, once this was really over and he was in prison, the governor would pardon him. The judge now moved to pick up the papers in connection with Stener's case, satisfied that he had given the financiers no chance to say he had not given due heed to their plea in Cowperwood's behalf, and yet certain that the politicians would be pleased that he had so nearly given Cowperwood the maximum while appearing to have heeded the pleas for mercy. Cowperwood saw through the trick at once, but it did not disturb him. It struck him as rather weak and contemptible. A bailiff came forward and started to hurry him away. "Allow the prisoner to remain for a moment," called the judge. The name of George W. Stener had been called by the clerk, and Cowperwood did not quite understand why he was being detained, but he soon learned. It was that he might hear the opinion of the court in connection with his co-partner in crime. The latter's record was taken. Roger O'Mara, the Irish political lawyer, who had been his counsel all through his troubles, stood near him, but had nothing to say beyond asking the judge to consider Stener's previously honorable career. "George W. Stener," said his honor, while the audience, including Cowperwood, listened attentively. "The motion for a new trial, as well as an arrest of judgment in your case, having been overruled, it remains for the court to impose such sentence as the nature of your offense requires. I do not desire to add to the pain of your position by any extended remarks of my own, but I cannot let the occasion pass without expressing my emphatic condemnation of your offense. The misapplication of public money has become the great crime of the age. If not promptly and firmly checked, it will ultimately destroy our institutions. When a republic becomes honeycombed with corruption, its vitality is gone. It must crumble upon the first pressure. In my opinion, the public is much to blame for your offense and others of a similar character. Heretofore, official fraud has been regarded with too much indifference. What we need is a higher and purer political morality, a state of public opinion which would make the improper use of public money a thing to be execrated. It was the lack of this which made your offense possible. Beyond that, I see nothing of extenuation in your case." Judge Paterson paused for emphasis. He was coming to his finest flight, and he wanted it to sink in. "The people had confided to you the care of their money," he went on solemnly. "It was a high, a sacred trust. You should have guarded the door of the treasury even as the cherubim protected the Garden of Eden, and should have turned the flaming sword of impeccable honesty against everyone who approached it improperly. Your position as the representative of a great community warranted that. In view of all the facts in your case, the court can do no less than impose a major penalty. The 74th section of the Criminal Procedure Act provides that no convict shall be sentenced by the court of this Commonwealth to either of the penitentiaries thereof for any term which shall expire between the 15th of November and the 15th day of February of any year. And this provision requires me to abate 3 months from the maximum of time which I would affix in your case, namely 5 years. The sentence of the court is, therefore, that you pay a fine of $5,000 to the Commonwealth for the use of the county." Paterson knew well enough that Stener could never pay that sum. "And that you undergo imprisonment in the state penitentiary for the Eastern District by separate and solitary confinement at labor for the period of 4 years and 9 months, and that you stand committed until this sentence is complied with." He laid down the briefs and rubbed his chin reflectively while both Cowperwood and Stener were hurried out. Butler was the first to leave after the sentence, quite satisfied. Seeing that all was over so far as she was concerned, Eileen stole quickly out, and after her, in a few moments, Cowperwood's father and brothers. They were to await him outside and go with him to the penitentiary. The remaining members of the family were at home eagerly awaiting intelligence of the morning's work, and Joseph Cowperwood was at once dispatched to tell them. The day had now become cloudy, lowery, and it looked as if there might be snow. Eddie Zanders, who had been given all the papers in the case, announced that there was no need to return to the county jail. In consequence, the 5 of them, Zanders, Steger, Cowperwood, his father, and Edward, got into a streetcar which ran to within a few blocks of the prison. Within half an hour they were at the gates of the Eastern Penitentiary. Chapter 53. The Eastern District Penitentiary of Pennsylvania, standing at Fairmount Avenue and 21st Street in Philadelphia, where Cowperwood was now to serve his sentence of 4 years and 3 months, was a large gray stone structure, solemn and momentous in its mien, not at all unlike the Palace of Sforzas at Milan, although not so distinguished. It stretched its gray length for several blocks along 4 different streets, and it looked as lonely and forbidding as a prison should. The wall which enclosed its great area, extending over 10 acres, and gave it so much of its solemn dignity, was 35 feet high and some 7 feet thick. The prison proper, which was not visible from the outside, consisted of 7 arms or corridors, ranged octopus-like around a central room or court, and occupying in their sprawling length about 2/3 of the yard enclosed within the walls, so that there was but little space for the charm of lawn or sward. The corridors, 42 feet wide from outer wall to outer wall, were 180 feet in length, and in 4 instances 2 stories high, and extended in their long reach in every direction. There were no windows in the corridors, only narrow slits of skylights, 3½ feet long by perhaps 8 inches wide, let in the roof. And the ground floor cells were accompanied in some instances by a small yard 10 by 16, the same size as the cells proper, which was surrounded by a high brick wall in every instance. The cells and floors and roofs were made of stone, and the corridors, which were only 10 feet wide between the cells, and in the case of the single-story portion only 15 feet high, were paved with stone. If you stood in the central room or rotunda and looked down the long stretches which departed from you in every direction, you had a sense of narrowness and confinement not compatible with their length. The iron doors, with their outer accompaniment of solid wooden ones, the latter used at times to shut the prisoner from all sight and sound, were grim and unpleasing to behold. The halls were light enough, being whitewashed frequently, and set with the narrow skylights, which were closed with frosted glass in winter. But they were, as are all such matter-of-fact arrangements for incarcerations, bare, wearisome to look upon. Life enough there was in all conscience, seeing that there were 400 prisoners here at that time, and that nearly every cell was occupied. But it was a life of which no one individual was essentially aware as a spectacle. He was of it, but he was not. Some of the prisoners, after long service, were used as trustees or runners, as they were locally called, but not many. There was a bakery, a machine shop, a carpenter shop, a storeroom, a flour mill, and a series of gardens, or truck patches, but the manipulation of these did not require the services of a large number. The prison proper dated from 1822, and it had grown, wing by wing, until its present considerable size had been reached. Its population consisted of individuals of all degrees of intelligence and crime, from murderers to minor practitioners of larceny. It had what was known as the Pennsylvania system of regulation for its inmates, which was nothing more or less than solitary confinement for all concerned, a life of absolute silence and separate labor in separate cells. Barring his comparatively recent experience in the county jail, which after all was far from typical, Cowperwood had never been in a prison in his life. Once, when a boy, in one of his perambulations through several of the surrounding towns, he had passed a village lock-up, as the town prisons were then called, a small, square gray building with long iron-barred windows, and he had seen, at one of these rather depressing apertures on the 2nd floor, a none too prepossessing drunkard or town ne'er-do-well who looked down on him with bleary eyes, unkempt hair, and a sodden, waxy, pallid face, and called, for it was summer and the jail window was open, "Hey, Sonny, get me a plug of tobacco, will you?" Cowperwood, who had looked up, shocked and disturbed by the man's disheveled appearance, had called back, quite without stopping to think, "No, I can't." "Well, look out you don't get locked up yourself sometime, you little runt," the man had replied savagely, only half recovered from his debauch of the day before. He had not thought of this particular scene in years, but now suddenly it came back to him. Here he was on his way to be locked up in this dull, somber prison, and it was snowing, and he was being cut out of human affairs as much as it was possible for him to be cut out. No friends were permitted to accompany him beyond the outer gate, not even Steger for the time being, though he might visit him later in the day. This was an inviolable rule. Xanders, being known to the gatekeeper and bearing his commitment paper, was admitted at once. The others turned solemnly away. They bade a gloomy, if affectionate, farewell to Cowperwood, who, on his part, attempted to give it all an air of inconsequence, as in part, and even here, it had for him. "Well, good-bye for the present," he said, shaking hands. "I'll be all right, and I'll get out soon. Wait and see. Tell Lillian not to worry." He stepped inside, and the gate clanked solemnly behind him. Xanders led the way through a dark, somber hall, wide and high-ceilinged, to a farther gate, where a second gateman, trifling with a large key, unlocked a barred door at his bidding. Once inside the prison yard, Xanders turned to the left into a small office, presenting his prisoner before a small, chest-high desk, where stood a prison officer in uniform of blue. The latter, the receiving overseer of the prison, a thin, practical, executive-looking person with narrow gray eyes and light hair, took the paper which the sheriff's deputy handed him and read it. This was his authority for receiving Cowperwood. In his turn, he handed Xanders a slip, showing that he had so received the prisoner. And then Xanders left, receiving gratefully the tip which Cowperwood pressed in his hand. "Well, good-bye, Mr. Cowperwood," he said with a peculiar twist of his detective-like head. "I'm sorry. I hope you won't find it so bad here." He wanted to impress the receiving overseer with his familiarity with this distinguished prisoner, and Cowperwood, true to his policy of make-believe, shook hands with him cordially. "I'm much obliged to you for your courtesy, Mr. Zanders," he said, then turned to his new master with the air of a man who is determined to make a good impression. He was now in the hands of petty officials, he knew, who could modify or increase his comfort at will. He wanted to impress this man with his utter willingness to comply and obey, his sense of respect for his authority, without in any way demeaning himself. He was depressed but efficient, even here in the clutch of that eventual machine of the law, the state penitentiary, which he had been struggling so hard to evade.
The receiving overseer, Roger Kendall, though thin and clerical, was a rather capable man as prison officials go, shrewd, not particularly well-educated, not over-intelligent naturally, not over-industrious, but sufficiently energetic to hold his position.
He knew something about convicts, considerable, for he had been dealing with them for nearly 26 years. His attitude toward them was cold, cynical, critical. He did not permit any of them to come into personal contact with him, but he saw to it that underlings in his presence carried out the requirements of the law. When Cowperwood entered, dressed in his very good clothing, a dark gray-blue twill suit of pure wool, a light, well-made gray overcoat, a black derby hat of the latest shape, his shoes new and of good leather, his tie of the best silk, heavy and conservatively colored, his hair and mustache showing the attention of an intelligent barber, and his hands well manicured, the receiving overseer saw at once that he was in the presence of someone of superior intelligence and force, such a man as the fortune of his trade rarely brought into his net. Cowperwood stood in the middle of the room without apparently looking at anyone or anything, though he saw all. "Convict number 3633. Kendall called to the clerk, handing him at the same time a yellow slip of paper on which was written Cowperwood's full name and his record number, counting from the beginning of the penitentiary itself. The underling, a convict, took it and entered it in a book, reserving the slip at the same time for the penitentiary runner or trustee, who would eventually take Cowperwood to the manners gallery. "You will have to take off your clothes and take a bath," said Kendall to Cowperwood, eyeing him curiously. "I don't suppose you need one, but it's the rule." "Thank you," replied Cowperwood, pleased that his personality was counting for something even here. "Whatever the rules are, I want to obey." When he started to take off his coat, however, Kendall put up his hand delayingly and tapped a bell. There now issued from an adjoining room an assistant, a prison servitor, a weird-looking specimen of the genus trustee. He was a small, dark, lopsided individual, one leg being slightly shorter, and therefore one shoulder lower than the other. He was hollow-chested, squint-eyed, and rather shambling, but spry enough withal. He was dressed in a thin, poorly-made, baggy suit of striped jeans, the prison stripes of the place, showing a soft roll-collar shirt underneath, and wearing a large, wide-striped cap, peculiarly offensive in its size and shape to Cowperwood. He could not help thinking how uncanny the man's squint eyes looked under its straight, outstanding visor. The trustee had a silly, sycophantic manner of raising one hand in salute. He was a professional second-story man, up for 10 years, but by dint of good behavior he had attained to the honor of working about this office without the degraded hood customary for prisoners to wear over the cap. For this he was properly grateful. He now considered his superior with nervous, dog-like eyes, and looked at Cowperwood with a certain cunning appreciation of his lot and a show of initial mistrust. One prisoner is as good as another to the average convict. As a matter of fact, it is their only consolation in their degradation that all who come here are no better than they. The world may have misused them, but they misuse their confreres in their thoughts. The holier-than-thou attitude, intentional or otherwise, is quite the last and most deadly offense within prison walls. This particular trustee could no more understand Cowperwood than could a fly the motions of a fly-wheel, but with the cocky superiority of the underling of the world he did not hesitate to think that he could. A crook was a crook to him, Cowperwood no less than the shabbiest pickpocket. His one feeling was that he would like to demean him, to pull him down to his own level. "You will have to take everything you have out of your pockets," Kendall now informed Cowperwood. Ordinarily he would have said, "Search the prisoner." Cowperwood stepped forward and laid out a purse with $25 in it, a penknife, a lead pencil, a small notebook, and a little ivory elephant which Eileen had given him once, for luck, and which he treasured solely because she gave it to him. Kendall looked at the latter curiously. "Now you can go on," he said to the trustee, referring to the undressing and bathing process which was to follow.
"This way,"
said the latter, addressing Cowperwood, and preceding him into an adjoining room, where 3 closets held 3 old-fashioned, iron-bodied, wooden-top bathtubs, with their attendant shelves for rough crash towels, yellow soap, and the like, and hooks for clothes. "Get in there," said the trustee, whose name was Thomas Kuby, pointing to one of the tubs. Cowperwood realized that this was the beginning of petty official supervision, but he deemed it wise to appear friendly even here. "I see," he said. "I will." "That's right," replied the attendant, somewhat placated. "What did you bring?" Cowperwood looked at him quizzically. He did not understand. The prison attendant realized that this man did not know the lingo of the place. "What did you bring?" he repeated. "How many years did you get?" "Oh," exclaimed Cowperwood comprehendingly, "I understand. 4 and 3 months." He decided to humor the man. It would probably be better so. "What for?" inquired Kuby familiarly. Cowperwood's blood chilled slightly. "Larceny," he said. "You got off easy," commented Kuby. "I'm up for 10. A rube judge did that to me." Kuby had never heard of Cowperwood's crime. He would not have understood its subtleties if he had. Cowperwood did not want to talk to this man. He did not know how. He wished he would go away, but that was not likely. He wanted to be put in his cell and let alone. "That's too bad," he answered, and the convict realized clearly that this man was really not one of them, or he would not have said anything like that. Kuby went to the 2 hydrants opening into the bathtub and turned them on. Cowperwood had been undressing the while, and now stood naked, but not ashamed, in front of this 8th-rate intelligence. "Don't forget to wash your head, too," said Kuby, and went away. Cowperwood stood there while the water ran, meditating on his fate. It was strange how life had dealt with him of late, so severely. Unlike most men in his position, he was not suffering from a consciousness of evil. He did not think he was evil. As he saw it, he was merely unfortunate. To think that he should be actually in this great silent penitentiary, a convict, waiting here beside this cheap iron bathtub, not very sweet or hygienic to contemplate, with this crack-brained criminal to watch over him. He stepped into the tub and washed himself briskly with a biting yellow soap, drying himself on one of the rough, only partially bleached towels. He looked for his underwear, but there was none. At this point the attendant looked in again. "Out here," he said inconsiderately. Cowperwood followed, naked. He was led through the receiving overseer's office into a room, where were scales, implements of measurement, a record book, etc. The attendant who stood guard at the door now came over, and the clerk who sat in a corner automatically took down a record blank. Kendall surveyed Cowperwood's decidedly graceful figure, already inclining to the slight thickening around the waist, and approved of it as superior to that of most who came here. His skin, as he particularly noted, was especially white. "Step on the scale," said the attendant brusquely. Cowperwood did so. The former adjusted the weights and scanned the record carefully. "Weight, 175, he called. "Now, step over here." He indicated a spot in the side wall where was fastened in a thin slat, which ran from the floor to about 7 1/2 feet above, perpendicularly, a small movable wooden indicator, which, when a man was standing under it, could be pressed down on his head. At the side of the slat were the total inches of height, laid off in halves, quarters, eighths, and so on, and to the right a length measurement for the arm. Cowperwood understood what was wanted and stepped under the indicator, standing quite straight. "Feet level, back to the wall," urged the attendant. "So, height, 5 feet 9 10/16, he called. The clerk in the corner noted it. He now produced a tape measure and began measuring Cowperwood's arms, legs, chest, waist, hips, etc. He called out the color of his eyes, his hair, his mustache, and, looking into his mouth, exclaimed, "Teeth, all sound." After Cowperwood had once more given his address, age, profession, whether he knew any trade, etc., which he did not, he was allowed to return to the bathroom and put on the clothing which the prison provided for him. First the rough, prickly underwear, then the cheap, soft roll collar, white cotton shirt, then the thick bluish-gray cotton socks of a quality such as he had never worn in his life, and over these a pair of indescribable rough leather clogs, which felt to his feet as though they were made of wood or iron, oily and heavy. He then drew on the shapeless, baggy trousers with their telltale stripes, and over his arms and chest the loose-cut, shapeless coat and waistcoat. He felt and knew, of course, that he looked very strange, wretched, and as he stepped out into the overseer's room again he experienced a peculiar sense of depression, a gone feeling which before this had not assailed him, and which now he did his best to conceal. This, then, was what society did to the criminal, he thought to himself. It took him and tore away from his body and his life the habiliments of his proper state, and left him these. He felt sad and grim, and, try as he would, he could not help showing it for a moment. It was always his business and his intention to conceal his real feelings, but now it was not quite possible. He felt degraded, impossible in these clothes, and he knew that he looked it. Nevertheless, he did his best to pull himself together and look unconcerned, willing, obedient, considerate of those above him. After all, he said to himself, it was all a play of sorts, a dream even, if one chose to view it so, a miasma even, from which, in the course of time and with a little luck, one might emerge safely enough. He hoped so. It could not last. He was only acting a strange, unfamiliar part on the stage, this stage of life that he knew so well. Kendall did not waste any time looking at him, however. He merely said to his assistant, "See if you can find a cap for him." And the latter, going to a closet containing numbered shelves, took down a cap, a high-crowned, straight-visored, shabby, striped affair which Cowperwood was asked to try on. It fitted well enough, slipping down close over his ears, and he thought that now his indignities must be about complete. What could be added? There could be no more of these disconcerting accoutrements, but he was mistaken. "Now, Kuby, you take him to Mr. Chapin," said Kendall. Kuby understood. He went back into the washroom and produced what Cowperwood had heard of, but never before seen, a blue-and-white striped cotton bag about half the length of an ordinary pillowcase, and half again as wide, which Kuby now unfolded and shook out as he came toward him. It was a custom. The use of this hood, dating from the earliest days of the prison, was intended to prevent a sense of location and direction, and thereby obviate any attempt to escape. Thereafter, during all his stay, he was not supposed to walk with, or talk to, or see another prisoner, not even to converse with his superiors, unless addressed. It was a grim theory, and yet one definitely enforced here, although, as he was to learn later, even this could be modified here.
"You'll have to put this on,"
Kuby said, and opened it in such a way that it could be put over Cowperwood's head. Cowperwood understood. He had heard of it in some way, in times past. He was a little shocked, looked at it first with a touch of real surprise, but a moment after lifted his hands and helped pull it down. "Never mind," cautioned the guard. "Put your hands down. I'll get it over." Cowperwood dropped his arms. When it was fully on, it came to about his chest, giving him little means of seeing anything. He felt very strange, very humiliated, very downcast. This simple thing of a blue-and-white striped bag over his head almost cost him his sense of self-possession. Why could not they have spared him this last indignity, he thought?
"This way,"
said his attendant, and he was led out. To where, he could not say.
"If you hold it out in front, you can see to walk,"
said his guide, and Cowperwood pulled it out, thus being able to discern his feet and a portion of the floor below. He was thus conducted, seeing nothing in his transit, down a short walk, then through a long corridor, then through a room of uniformed guards, and finally up a narrow flight of iron steps leading to the overseer's office on the second floor of one of the two-tier blocks. There he heard the voice of Kuby saying,
"Mr. Chapin, here's another prisoner for you from Mr. Kendall."
"I'll be there in a minute," came a peculiarly pleasant voice from the distance. Presently a big, heavy hand closed about his arm, and he was conducted still further. "You ain't got far to go now," the voice said, "and then I'll take that bag off." And Cowperwood felt, for some reason, a sense of sympathy, perhaps, as though he would choke. The further steps were not many. A cell door was reached and unlocked by the inserting of a great iron key. It was swung open, and the same big hand guided him through. A moment later the bag was pulled easily from his head, and he saw that he was in a narrow, whitewashed cell, rather dim, windowless, but lighted from the top by a small skylight of frosted glass, 3½ feet long by 4 inches wide. For a nightlight there was a tin-bodied lamp swinging from a hook near the middle of one of the side walls. A rough iron cot, furnished with a straw mattress and 2 pairs of dark blue, probably unwashed blankets, stood in one corner. There was a hydrant and small sink in another. A small shelf occupied the wall opposite the bed. A plain wooden chair with a homely round back stood at the foot of the bed, and a fairly serviceable broom was standing in one corner. There was an iron stool or pot for excreta, giving, as he could see, into a large drain-pipe which ran along the inside wall, and which was obviously flushed by buckets of water being poured into it. Rats and other vermin infested this, and it gave off an unpleasant odor which filled the cell. The floor was of stone. Cowperwood's clear-seeing eyes took it all in at a glance. He noticed the hard cell door, which was barred and cross-barred with great round rods of steel, and fastened with a thick, highly polished lock. He saw also that beyond this was a heavy wooden door, which could shut him in even more completely than the iron one. There was no chance for any clear, purifying sunlight here. Cleanliness depended entirely on whitewash, soap and water, and sweeping, which in turn depended on the prisoners themselves. He also took in Chapin, the homely, good-natured cell overseer, whom he now saw for the first time. A large, heavy, lumbering man, rather dusty and misshapen-looking, whose uniform did not fit him well, and whose manner of standing made him look as though he would much prefer to sit down. He was obviously bulky, but not strong, and his kindly face was covered with a short growth of grayish-brown whiskers. His hair was cut badly and stuck out in odd strings or wisps from underneath his big cap. Nevertheless, Cowperwood was not at all unfavorably impressed. Quite the contrary, and he felt at once that this man might be more considerate of him than the others had been. He hoped so, anyhow. He did not know that he was in the presence of the overseer of the manners squad, who would have him in charge for 2 weeks only, instructing him in the rules of the prison, and that he was only one of 26, all told, who were in Chapin's care. That worthy, by way of easy introduction, now went over to the bed and seated himself on it. He pointed to the hard wooden chair, which Cowperwood drew out and sat on. "Well, now you're here, ain't you?" he asked, and answered himself quite genially, for he was an unlettered man, generously disposed, of long experience with criminals, and inclined to deal kindly with them. Age and a naturally kindly temperament, and a form of religious belief, Quakerism, had inclined him to be merciful, and yet his official duties, as Cowperwood later found out, seemed to have led him to the conclusion that most criminals were innately bad. Like Kendall, he regarded them as weaklings and ne'er-do-wells with evil streaks in them, and in the main he was not mistaken.
Yet he could not help being what he was, a fatherly, kindly old man, having faith in those shibboleths of the weak and inexperienced mentally, human justice and human decency.
"Yes, I'm here, Mr. Chapin," Cowperwood replied simply, remembering his name from the attendant, and flattering the keeper by the use of it. To old Chapin the situation was more or less puzzling. This was the famous Frank A. Cowperwood, whom he had read about, the noted banker and treasury looter. He and his co-partner in crime, Stenner, were destined to serve, as he had read, comparatively long terms here. $500,000 was a large sum of money in those days, much more than $5 million would have been 40 years later. He was awed by the thought of what had become of it, how Cowperwood managed to do all the things the papers had said he had done. He had a little formula of questions which he usually went through with each new prisoner, asking him if he was sorry now for the crime he had committed, if he meant to do better with a new chance, if his father and mother were alive, etc. And by the manner in which they answered these questions, simply, regretfully, defiantly, or otherwise, he judged whether they were being adequately punished or not. Yet he could not talk to Cowperwood as he now saw, or as he would to the average second-story burglar, store looter, pickpocket, and plain cheap thief and swindler, and yet he scarcely knew how else to talk. "Well, now," he went on, "I don't suppose you ever thought you'd get to a place like this, did you, Mr. Cowperwood?" "I never did," replied Frank simply. "I wouldn't have believed it a few months ago, Mr. Chapin. I don't think I deserve to be here now, though of course there is no use in my telling you that." He saw that old Chapin wanted to moralize a little, and he was only too glad to fall in with his mood. He would soon be alone, with no one to talk to perhaps, and if a sympathetic understanding could be reached with this man now, so much the better. Any port in a storm, any straw to a drowning man. "Well, no doubt all of us makes mistakes," continued Mr. Chapin, superiorly, with an amusing faith in his own value as a moral guide and reformer. "We can't just always tell how the plans we think so fine are coming out, can we? You're here now, and I suppose you're sorry certain things didn't come out just as you thought. But if you had a chance, I don't suppose you'd try to do just as you did before, now would you?" "No, Mr. Chapin, I wouldn't exactly," said Cowperwood truly enough, "though I believed I was right in everything I did. I don't think legal justice has really been done me." "Well, that's the way," continued Chapin meditatively, scratching his grizzled head and looking genially about. "Sometimes, as I allus say to some of those here young fellers that comes in here, we don't know as much as we thinks we does. We forget that others are just as smart as we are, and that there are allers people that are watching us all the time. These here courts and jails and detectives, they're here all the time, and they get us. By God," Chapin's moral version of by God, "they do, if we don't behave." "Yes," Cowperwood replied, "that's true enough, Mr. Chapin." "Well," continued the old man after a time, after he had made a few more solemn, owl-like, and yet well-intentioned remarks, "now here's your bed, and there's your chair,
and there's your washstand, and there's your water closet. Now keep 'em all clean and use 'em right."
You would have thought he was making Cowperwood a present of a fortune.
"You're the ones got to make up your bed every morning and keep your floor swept and your toilet flushed and your cell clean. There ain't anybody here do that for you. You want to do all them things the first thing in the morning when you get up, and afterward you'll get something to eat about 6:30. You're supposed to get up at 5:30.
"Yes, Mr. Chapin," Cowperwood said politely. "You can depend on me to do all those things promptly."
"There ain't so much more," added Chapin. "You're supposed to wash yourself all over once a week, and I'll give you a clean towel for that. Next you gotta wash this floor up every Friday morning."
Cowperwood winced at that.
"You can have hot water for that if you want it. I'll have one of the runners bring it to you. And as for your friends and relations—"
He got up and shook himself like a big Newfoundland dog.
"You got a wife, ain't you?"
"Yes," replied Cowperwood.
"Well, the rules here are that your wife and your friends can come to see you once in 3 months, and your lawyer—you got a lawyer, ain't you?"
"Yes, sir," replied Cowperwood, amused.
"Well, he can come every week or so if he likes. Every day, I guess. There ain't no rules about lawyers. But you can only write one letter once in 3 months yourself, and if you want anything like tobacco or the like of that from the storeroom, you got to sign an order for it. If you got any money with the warden, and then I can get it for you."
The old man was really above taking small tips in the shape of money. He was a holdover from a much more severe and honest regime, but subsequent presents or constant flattery were not amiss in making him kindly and generous. Cowperwood read him accurately.
"Very well, Mr. Chapin, I understand," he said, getting up as the old man did.
"And when you have been here 2 weeks," added Chapin rather ruminatively, he had forgot to state this to Cowperwood before, "the warden will come down and get you and give you your regular cell summons downstairs. You can make up your mind by that time what you'd like to do, what you'd like to work at. If you behave yourself proper, more like they'll give you a cell with a yard. You never can tell."
He went out, locking the door with a solemn click, and Cowperwood stood there, a little more depressed than he had been, because of this latest intelligence. Only 2 weeks, and then he would be transferred from this kindly old man's care to another's, whom he did not know and with whom he might not fare so well.
"If ever you want me for anything, if you're sick or something like that,"
Chapin now returned to say after he had walked a few paces away,
"we have a signal here of our own. Just hang your towel out through these here bars, and I'll see it, and I'll stop and find out what you want when I'm passing."
Cowperwood, whose spirits had sunk, revived for the moment. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Thank you, Mr. Chapin." The old man walked away, and Cowperwood heard his steps dying down the cement-paved hall. He stood and listened, his ears being greeted occasionally by a distant cough, a faint scraping of someone's feet, the hum or whir of a machine, or the iron scratch of a key in a lock. None of the noises was loud. Rather, they were all faint and far away. He went over and looked at the bed, which was not very clean and without linen, and anything but wide or soft, and felt it curiously. So here was where he was to sleep from now on, he who so craved and appreciated luxury and refinement. If Eileen or some of his rich friends should see him here, worse, he was sickened by the thought of possible vermin. How could he tell? How would he do? The one chair was abominable, the skylight was weak. He tried to think of himself as becoming accustomed to the situation, but he rediscovered the offal pot in one corner, and that discouraged him. It was possible that rats might come up here. It looked that way. No pictures, no books, no scene, no person, no space to walk, just the 4 bare walls and silence, which he would be shut into at night by the thick door. What a horrible fate! He sat down and contemplated his situation. So here he was at last in the Eastern Penitentiary, and doomed, according to the judgment of the politicians, Butler among others, to remain here 4 long years and longer. Stenner, it suddenly occurred to him, was probably being put through the same process he had just gone through. Poor old Stenner! What a fool he had made of himself! But because of his foolishness, he deserved all he was now getting. But the difference between himself and Stenner was that they would let Stenner out. It was possible that already they were easing his punishment in some way that he, Cowperwood, did not know. He put his hand to his chin, thinking. His business, his house, his friends, his family, Eileen. He felt for his watch, but remembered that they had taken that. There was no way of telling the time. Neither had he any notebook, pen, or pencil with which to amuse or interest himself. Besides, he had nothing to eat since morning. Still, that mattered little. What did matter was that he was shut up here, away from the world, quite alone, quite lonely, without knowing what time it was,
and that he could not attend to any of the things he ought to be attending to, his business affairs, his future. True, Steger would probably come to see him after a while. That would help a little. But even so, think of his position, his prospects up to the day of the fire, and his state now. He sat looking at his shoes, his suit. God! He got up and walked to and fro, but his own steps and movements sounded so loud. He walked to the cell door and looked out through the thick bars, but there was nothing to see, nothing save a portion of 2 cell doors opposite, something like his own. He came back and sat in his single chair, meditating, but getting weary of that finally stretched himself on the dirty prison bed to try it. It was not uncomfortable entirely. He got up after a while, however, and sat, then walked, then sat. What a narrow place to walk, he thought. This was horrible, something like a living tomb. And to think he should be here now, day after day and day after day, until what? Until the governor pardoned him, or his time was up, or his fortune eaten away, or— So he cogitated while the hours slipped by. It was nearly 5 o'clock before Steger was able to return, and then only for a little while. He had been arranging for Cowperwood's appearance on the following Thursday, Friday, and Monday in his several court proceedings. When he had gone, however, and the night fell and Cowperwood had to trim his little shabby oil lamp, and to drink the strong tea and eat the rough, poor bread made of bran and white flour, which was shoved to him through the small aperture in the door by the trencher trustee, who was accompanied by the overseer to see that it was done properly, he really felt very badly. And after that the center wooden door of his cell was presently closed and locked by a trustee, who slammed it rudely and said no word. 9 o'clock would be sounded somewhere by a great bell, he understood, when his smoky oil lamp would have to be put out promptly, and he would have to undress and go to bed. There were punishments, no doubt, for infractions of these rules, reduced rations, the strait-jacket, perhaps stripes. He scarcely knew what. He felt disconsolate, grim, weary. He had put up such a long, unsatisfactory fight. After washing his heavy stone cup and tin plate at the hydrant, he took off the sickening uniform and shoes and even the drawers of the scratching underwear, and stretched himself wearily on the bed. The place was not any too warm, and he tried to make himself comfortable between the blankets, but it was of little use. His soul was cold. "This will never do," he said to himself. "This will never do. I'm not sure whether I can stand much of this or not." Still, he turned his face to the wall, and after several hours, sleep eventually came. Chapter 54. Those who by any pleasing courtesy of fortune, accident of birth, inheritance, or the wisdom of parents or friends, have succeeded in avoiding making that anathema of the prosperous and comfortable a mess of their lives, will scarcely understand the mood of Cowperwood, sitting rather gloomily in his cell these first days, wondering what, in spite of his great ingenuity, was to become of him. The strongest have their hours of depression. There are times when life to those endowed with the greatest intelligence, perhaps mostly to those, takes on a somber hue. They see so many phases of its dreary subtleties. It is only when the soul of man has been built up into some strange self-confidence, some curious faith in its own powers, based, no doubt, on the actual presence of these same powers subtly involved in the body, that it fronts life unflinchingly. It would be too much to say that Cowperwood's mind was of the first order. It was subtle enough in all conscience, and involved, as is common with the executively great, with a strong sense of personal advancement. It was a powerful mind, turning like a vast searchlight, a glittering ray into many a dark corner, but it was not sufficiently disinterested to search the ultimate dark. He realized, in a way, what the great astronomers, sociologists, philosophers, chemists, physicists, and physiologists were meditating, but he could not be sure in his own mind that, whatever it was important for him. No doubt life held many strange secrets. Perhaps it was essential that somebody should investigate them. However that might be, the call of his own soul was in another direction. His business was to make money, to organize something which would make him much money, or, better yet, save the organization he had begun. But this, as he now looked upon it, was almost impossible. It had been too disarranged and complicated by unfortunate circumstances. He might, as Steger pointed out to him, string out these bankruptcy proceedings for years, tiring out one creditor and another, but in the meantime the properties involved were being seriously damaged. Interest charges on his unsatisfied loans were making heavy inroads.
Court costs were mounting up, and to cap it all, he had discovered with Steger that there were a number of creditors, those who had sold out to Butler, and incidentally to Mollenhauer, who would never accept anything except the full value of their claims. His one hope now was to save what he could by compromise a little later, and to build up some sort of profitable business through Stephen Wingate. The latter was coming in a day or two, as soon as Steger had made some working arrangement for him with Warden Michael Desmas, who came the second day to have a look at the new prisoner. Desmas was a large man physically, Irish by birth, a politician by training, who had been one thing and another in Philadelphia, from a policeman in his early days and a corporal in the Civil War to a ward captain under Mollenhauer. He was a canny man, tall, raw-boned, singularly muscular-looking, who for all his 57 years looked as though he could give a splendid account of himself in a physical contest. His hands were large and bony, his face more square than either round or long, and his forehead high. He had a vigorous growth of short-clipped iron-gray hair and a bristly iron-gray mustache, very short. Keen, intelligent blue-gray eyes, a florid complexion, and even-edged, savage-looking teeth, which showed the least bit in a slightly wolfish way when he smiled. However, he was not as cruel a person as he looked to be. Temperamental, to a certain extent hard, and on occasions savage, but with kindly hours also. His greatest weakness was that he was not quite mentally able to recognize that there were mental and social differences between prisoners, and that now and then one was apt to appear here who, with or without political influences, was eminently worthy of special consideration. What he could recognize was the differences pointed out to him by the politicians in special cases, such as that of Stenner, not Cowperwood. However, seeing that the prison was a public institution, apt to be visited at any time by lawyers, detectives, doctors, preachers, propagandists, and the public generally, and that certain rules and regulations had to be enforced, if for no other reason than to keep a moral and administrative control over his own help,
it was necessary to maintain, and that even in the face of the politician, a certain amount of discipline, system, and order, and it was not possible to be too liberal with anyone.
There were, however, exceptional cases. Men of wealth and refinement, victims of those occasional uprisings which so shocked the political leaders generally, who had to be looked after in a friendly way. Desmas was quite aware, of course, of the history of Cowperwood and Stenner. The politicians had already given him warning that Stenner, because of his past services to the community, was to be treated with special consideration. Not so much was said about Cowperwood, although they did admit that his lot was rather hard. Perhaps he might do a little something for him, but at his own risk. "Butler is down on him," Strobick said to Desmas on one occasion. "It's that girl of his that's at the bottom of it all. If you listen to Butler, you'd feed him on bread and water, but he isn't a bad fellow. As a matter of fact, if George had had any sense, Cowperwood wouldn't be where he is today. But the big fellows wouldn't let Stenner alone. They wouldn't let him give Cowperwood any money." Although Strobick had been one of those who, under pressure from Mollenhauer, had advised Stenner not to let Cowperwood have any more money, yet here he was pointing out the folly of the victim's course. The thought of the inconsistency involved did not trouble him in the least. Desmas decided, therefore, that if Cowperwood were persona non grata to the Big Three, it might be necessary to be indifferent to him, or at least slow in extending him any special favors. For Stenner, a good chair, clean linen, special cutlery and dishes, the daily papers, privileges in the matter of mail, the visits of friends, and the like. For Cowperwood, well, he would have to look at Cowperwood and see what he thought. At the same time, Steger's intercessions were not without their effect on Desmas. So the morning after Cowperwood's entrance, the warden received a letter from Terence Relihan, the Harrisburg potentate, indicating that any kindness shown to Mr. Cowperwood would be duly appreciated by him. Upon the receipt of this letter, Desmas went up and looked through Cowperwood's iron door. On the way, he had a brief talk with Chapin, who told him what a nice man he thought Cowperwood was. Desmas had never seen Cowperwood before, but in spite of the shabby uniform, the clogged shoes, the cheap shirt, and the wretched cell, he was impressed. Instead of the weak, anemic body and the shifty eyes of the average prisoner, he saw a man whose face and form blazed energy and power, and whose vigorous erectness no wretched clothes or conditions could demean. He lifted his head when Desmas appeared, glad that any form should have appeared at his door, and looked at him with large, clear, examining eyes, those eyes that in the past had inspired so much confidence and surety in all those who had known him. Desmas was stirred. Compared with Stenner, whom he knew in the past and whom he had met on his entry, this man was a force. Say what you will, one vigorous man inherently respects another, and Desmas was vigorous physically. He eyed Cowperwood, and Cowperwood eyed him. Instinctively, Desmas liked him. He was like one tiger looking at another. Instinctively, Cowperwood knew that he was the warden. "This is Mr. Desmas, isn't it?" he asked, courteously and pleasantly. "Yes, sir, I'm the man," replied Desmas interestedly. "These rooms are not as comfortable as they might be, are they?" The warden's even teeth showed in a friendly yet wolfish way. "They certainly are not, Mr. Desmas," replied Cowperwood, standing very erect and soldier-like. "I didn't imagine I was coming to a hotel, however." He smiled. "There isn't anything special I can do for you, is there, Mr. Cowperwood?" began Desmas curiously, for he was moved by a thought that at some time or other a man such as this might be of service to him. "I've been talking to your lawyer." Cowperwood was intensely gratified by the Mr. So that was the way the wind was blowing. Well, then, within reason, things might not prove so bad here. He would see. He would sound this man out. "I don't want to be asking anything, Warden, which you cannot reasonably give," he now returned politely. "But there are a few things, of course, that I would change if I could. I wish I might have sheets for my bed, and I could afford better underwear if you would let me wear it. This that I have on annoys me a great deal." "They're not the best wool, that's true enough," replied Desmas solemnly. "They're made for the state out here in Pennsylvania somewhere. I suppose there's no objection to your wearing your own underwear if you want to. I'll see about that. And the sheets, too. We might let you use them if you have them. We'll have to go a little slow about this. There are a lot of people that take a special interest in showing the warden how to tend his business." "I can readily understand that, Warden," went on Cowperwood briskly, "and I'm certainly very much obliged to you. You may be sure that anything you do for me here will be appreciated and not misused, and that I have friends on the outside who can reciprocate for me in the course of time." He talked slowly and emphatically, looking Desmas directly in the eye all of the time. Desmas was very much impressed. "That's all right," he said, now that he had gone so far as to be friendly. "I can't promise much. Prison rules are prison rules, but there are some things that can be done because it's the rule to do them for other men when they behave themselves. You can have a better chair than that, if you want it, and something to read, too. If you're in business yet, I wouldn't want to do anything to stop that. We can't have people running in and out of here every 15 minutes, and you can't turn a cell into a business office. That's not possible. It would break up the order of the place. Still, there's no reason why you shouldn't see some of your friends now and then. As for your mail, well, that will have to be opened in the ordinary way for the time being, anyhow. I'll have to see about that. I can't promise too much. You'll have to wait until you come out of this block and downstairs. Some of the cells have a yard there, if there are any empty." The warden cocked his eye wisely, and Cowperwood saw that his lot was not to be as bad as he had anticipated, though bad enough. The warden spoke to him about the different trades he might follow, and asked him to think about the one he would prefer. "You want to have something to keep your hands busy, whatever else you want. You'll find you'll need that. Everybody here wants to work after a time. I noticed that." Cowperwood understood and thanked Desmas profusely. The horror of idleness in silence, and in a cell scarcely large enough to turn around in comfortably, had already begun to creep over him, and the thought of being able to see Wingate and Steger frequently, and to have his mail reach him, after a time, untampered with, was a great relief. He was to have his own underwear, silk and wool, thank God, and perhaps they would let him take off these shoes after a while. With these modifications and a trade, and perhaps the little yard which Desmas had referred to, his life would be, if not ideal, at least tolerable. The prison was still a prison, but it looked as though it might not be so much of a terror to him as obviously it must be to many. During the 2 weeks in which Cowperwood was in the manners squad in care of Chapin, he learned nearly as much as he ever learned of the general nature of prison life.
For this was not an ordinary penitentiary in the sense that the prison yard, the prison squad, the prison lock-step, the prison dining room, and prison-associated labor make the ordinary penitentiary.
There was for him, and for most of those confined there, no general prison life whatsoever. The large majority were supposed to work silently in their cells at the particular tasks assigned them, and not to know anything of the remainder of the life which went on around them, the rule of this prison being solitary confinement, and few being permitted to work at the limited number of outside menial tasks provided. Indeed, as he sensed, and as old Chapin soon informed him, not more than 75 of the 400 prisoners confined here were so employed, and not all of these regularly, cooking, gardening in season, milling, and general cleaning being the only avenues of escape from solitude. Even those who so worked were strictly forbidden to talk, and although they did not have to wear the objectionable hood when actually employed, they were supposed to wear it in going to and from their work. Cowperwood saw them occasionally tramping by his cell door, and it struck him as strange, uncanny, grim. He wished sincerely at times, since old Chapin was so genial and talkative, that he were to be under him permanently, but it was not to be. His 2 weeks soon passed, drearily enough in all conscience, but they passed, interlaced with his few commonplace tasks of bed-making, floor-sweeping, dressing, eating, undressing, rising at 5:30 and retiring at 9, washing his several dishes after each meal, etc. He thought he would never get used to the food. Breakfast, as had been said, was at 6:30, and consisted of coarse black bread made of bran and some white flour, and served with black coffee. Dinner was at 11:30, and consisted of bean or vegetable soup, with some coarse meat in it, and the same bread. Supper was at 6, of tea and bread, very strong tea, and the same bread. No butter, no milk, no sugar. Cowperwood did not smoke, so the small allowance of tobacco, which was permitted, was without value to him. Steger called in every day for 2 or 3 weeks, and after the second day, Stephen Wingate, as his new business associate, was permitted to see him also, once every day, if he wished, Desmond stated, though the latter felt he was stretching a point in permitting this so soon. Both of these visits rarely occupied more than an hour, or an hour and a half, and after that the day was long. He was taken out on several days on a court order between 9 and 5 to testify in the bankruptcy proceedings against him, which caused the time in the beginning to pass quickly. It was curious, once he was in prison, safely shut from the world for a period of years apparently, how quickly all thought of assisting him departed from the minds of those who had been most friendly. He was done, so most of them thought. The only thing they could do now would be to use their influences to get him out some time. How soon, they could not guess. Beyond that, there was nothing. He would really never be of any great importance to anyone any more, or so they thought. It was very sad, very tragic, but he was gone. His place knew him not. "A bright young man, that," observed President Davison of the Girard National on reading of Cowperwood's sentence and incarceration. "Too bad, too bad. He made a great mistake." Only his parents, Eileen and his wife, the latter with mingled feelings of resentment and sorrow, really missed him. Eileen, because of her great passion for him, was suffering most of all. 4 years and 3 months, she thought. If he did not get out before then, she would be nearing 29, and he would be nearing 40. Would he want her then? Would she be so attractive? And would nearly 5 years change his point of view? He would have to wear a convict suit all that time, and be known as a convict forever after. It was hard to think about, but only made her more than ever determined to cling to him, whatever happened, and to help him all she could. Indeed, the day after his incarceration, she drove out and looked at the grim gray walls of the penitentiary. Knowing nothing absolutely of the vast and complicated process of law and penal servitude, it seemed especially terrible to her. What might not they be doing to her Frank? Was he suffering much? Was he thinking of her as she was of him? Oh, the pity of it all, the pity of herself, her great love for him. She drove home determined to see him. But as he had originally told her that visiting days were only once in 3 months, and that he would have to write her when the next one was, or when she could come, or when he could see her on the outside, she scarcely knew what to do. Secrecy was the thing. The next day, however, she wrote him just the same, describing the drive she had taken on the stormy afternoon before, the terror of the thought that he was behind those grim gray walls, and declaring her determination to see him soon. And this letter, under the new arrangement, he received at once. He wrote her in reply, giving the letter to Wingate to mail. It ran, "My sweet girl, I fancy you are a little downhearted to think I cannot be with you any more soon, but you mustn't be. I suppose you read all about the sentence in the paper. I came out here the same morning, nearly noon. If I had time, dearest, I'd write you a long letter describing the situation so as to ease your mind, but I haven't. It's against the rules, and I'm really doing this secretly. I'm here, though, safe enough, and wish I were out, of course. Sweetest, you must be careful how you try to see me at first. You can't do me much service outside of cheering me up, and you may do yourself great harm. Besides, I think I have done you far more harm than I can ever make up to you, and that you had best give me up, although I know you do not think so, and I would be sad if you did. I am to be in the Court of Special Pleas, 6th and Chestnut, on Friday at 2 o'clock, but you cannot see me there. I'll be out in charge of my counsel. You must be careful. Perhaps you'll think better and not come here." This last touch was one of pure gloom, the first Cowperwood had ever introduced into their relationship, but conditions had changed him. Hitherto he had been in the position of the superior being, the one who was being sought, although Eileen was and had been well worth seeking. And he had thought that he might escape unscathed, and so grow in dignity and power until she might not possibly be worthy of him any longer. He had had that thought, but here, in Stripes, it was a different matter. Eileen's position, reduced in value as it was by her long, ardent relationship with him, was now nevertheless superior to his, apparently so. For after all, was she not Edward Butler's daughter, and might she, after she had been away from him for a while, wish to become a convict's bride? She ought not to want to, and she might not want to, for all he knew. She might change her mind. She ought not to wait for him. Her life was not yet ruined. The public did not know, so he thought, not generally anyhow, that she had been his mistress. She might marry, why not, and so pass out of his life forever? And would not that be sad for him? And yet did he not owe it to her, to a sense of fair play in himself, to ask her to give him up, or at least think over the wisdom of doing so? He did her the justice to believe that she would not want to give him up, and in his position, however harmful it might be to her, it was an advantage, a connecting link with the finest period of his past life, to have her continue to love him. He could not, however, scribbling this note in a cell in Wingate's presence, and giving it to him to mail — Overseer Chapin was kindly keeping a respectful distance, though he was supposed to be present — refrain from adding, at the last moment, this little touch of doubt which, when she read it, struck Eileen to the heart. She read it as gloom on his part, as great depression. Perhaps, after all, the penitentiary, and so soon, was really breaking his spirit, and he had held up so courageously so long. Because of this, now she was madly eager to get to him, to console him, even though it was difficult, perilous. She must, she said. In regard to visits from the various members of his family, his mother and father, his brother, his wife, and his sister, Cowperwood made it plain to them, on one of the days on which he was out attending a bankruptcy hearing, that even providing it could be arranged, he did not think they should come oftener than once in 3 months, unless he wrote them, or sent word by Steger. The truth was that he really did not care to see much of any of them at present. He was sick of the whole social scheme of things. In fact, he wanted to be rid of the turmoil he had been in, seeing it had proved so useless. He had used nearly $15,000 thus far in defending himself, court costs, family maintenance, Steger, etc., but he did not mind that. He expected to make some little money working through Wingate. His family were not utterly without funds, sufficient to live on in a small way.
He had advised them to remove into houses more in keeping with their reduced circumstances, which they had done, his mother and father and brothers and sister to a 3-story brick house of about the caliber of the old Buttonwood Street house,
and his wife to a smaller, less expensive 2-story one on North 21st Street, near the penitentiary, a portion of the money saved out of the $35,000 extracted from Stenner, under the false pretenses aiding to sustain it. Of course, all this was a terrible descent from the Girard Avenue mansion for the elder Cowperwood, for here was none of the furniture which characterized the other somewhat gorgeous domicile, merely store-bought, ready-made furniture, and neat but cheap hangings and fixtures generally. The assignees, to whom all Cowperwood's personal property belonged, and to whom Cowperwood, the elder, had surrendered all his holdings, would not permit anything of importance to be removed. It had all to be sold for the benefit of creditors. A few very small things, but only a few, had been kept, as everything had been inventoried some time before. One of the things which old Cowperwood wanted was his own desk, which Frank had designed for him. But as it was valued at $500, it could not be relinquished by the sheriff except on payment of that sum, or by auction, and as Henry Cowperwood had no such sum to spare, he had had to let the desk go. There were many things they all wanted, and Anna Adelaide had literally purloined a few things she did not admit the fact to her parents until long afterward. There came a day when the 2 houses in Girard Avenue were the scene of a sheriff's sale, during which the general public, without let or hindrance, was permitted to tramp through the rooms and examine the pictures, statuary, and objects of art generally, which were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Considerable fame had attached to Cowperwood's activities in this field, owing in the first place to the real merit of what he had brought together, and in the next place to the enthusiastic comment of such men as Wilton Ellsworth, Fletcher Norton, Gordon Strake, architects and art dealers whose judgment and taste were considered important in Philadelphia. All of the lovely things by which he had set great store, small bronzes, representative of the best period of the Italian Renaissance, bits of Venetian glass which he had collected with great care, a full curio case, statues by Powers, Hosmer, and Thorwaldsen, things which would be smiled at 30 years later, but which were of high value then. All of his pictures by representative American painters from Gilbert to Eastman Johnson, together with a few specimens of the current French and English schools, went for a song. Art judgment in Philadelphia at this time was not exceedingly high, and some of the pictures, for lack of appreciative understanding, were disposed of at much too low a figure. Strake, Norton, and Ellsworth were all present and bought liberally. Senator Simpson, Mollenhauer, and Strobrick came to see what they could see. The small fry politicians were there en masse. But Simpson, calm judge of good art, secured practically the best of all that was offered. To him went the curio case of Venetian glass, 1 pair of tall blue and white Mohammedan cylindrical vases, 14 examples of Chinese jade, including several artists' water dishes, and a pierced window screen of the faintest tinge of green. To Mollenhauer went the furniture and decorations of the entry hall and reception room of Henry Cowperwood's house, and to Edward Strobrick 2 of Cowperwood's bird's-eye maple bedroom suites for the most modest of prices. Adam Davis was present, and secured the secrétaire of Boule, which the elder Cowperwood prized so highly. To Fletcher Norton went the 4 Greek vases, a kylix, a water jar, and 2 amphorae, which he had sold to Cowperwood, and which he valued highly. Various objects of art, including a Sèvres dinner set, a Gobelin tapestry, Barre bronzes and pictures by Détaille, Fortuny, and Georges Anne, went to Walter Lee. Arthur Rivers, Joseph Zimmerman, Judge Kitchen, Harper Steger, Terence Relihan, Trenor Drake, Mr. and Mrs. Simeon Jones, W.C. Davison, Frewen Casson, Fletcher Norton, and Judge Rafalski. Within 4 days after the sale began, the 2 houses were bare of their contents. Even the objects in the house at 931 North 10th Street had been withdrawn from storage, where they had been placed at the time it was deemed advisable to close this institution, and placed on sale with the other objects in the 2 homes. It was at this time that the senior Cowperwoods first learned of something which seemed to indicate a mystery which had existed in connection with their son and his wife. No one of all the Cowperwoods was present during all this gloomy distribution, and Eileen, reading of the disposition of all the wares, and knowing their value to Cowperwood, to say nothing of their charm for her, was greatly depressed. Yet she was not long despondent, for she was convinced that Cowperwood would some day regain his liberty, and attain a position of even greater significance in the financial world. She could not have said why, but she was sure of it. Chapter 55. In the meanwhile, Cowperwood had been transferred to a new overseer and a new cell in Block 3 on the ground floor, which was like all the others in size, 10 by 16, but to which was attached the small yard previously mentioned. Warden Desmas came up 2 days before he was transferred, and had another short conversation with him through his cell door. "You'll be transferred on Monday," he said in his reserved, slow way. "They'll give you a yard, though it won't be much good to you. We only allow a half-hour a day in it. I've told the overseer about your business arrangements. He'll treat you right in that matter. Just be careful not to take up too much time that way, and things will work out. I've decided to let you learn caning chairs. That'll be the best for you. It's easy, and it'll occupy your mind." The warden and some allied politicians made a good thing out of this prison industry. It was really not hard labor. The tasks set were simple and not oppressive, but all of the products were promptly sold and the profits pocketed. It was good, therefore, to see all the prisoners working, and it did them good. Cowperwood was glad of the chance to do something, for he really did not care so much for books, and his connection with Wingate and his old affairs were not sufficient to employ his mind in a satisfactory way. At the same time, he could not help thinking, if he seemed strange to himself now, how much stranger he would seem then, behind these narrow bars working at so commonplace a task as caning chairs. Nevertheless, he now thanked Desmas for this, as well as for the sheets and the toilet articles which had just been brought in. "That's all right," replied the latter pleasantly and softly, by now much intrigued by Cowperwood. "I know that there are men and men here, the same as anywhere. If a man knows how to use these things and wants to be clean, I wouldn't be one to put anything in his way." The new overseer with whom Cowperwood had to deal with was a very different person from Elias Chapin. His name was Walter Bonhag, and he was not more than 37 years of age, a big, flabby sort of person with a crafty mind, whose principal object in life was to see that this prison situation, as he found it, should furnish him a better income than his normal salary provided. A close study of Bonhag would have seemed to indicate that he was a stool pigeon of Desmas, but this was really not true except in a limited way. Because Bonhag was shrewd and sycophantic, quick to see a point in his or anybody else's favor, Desmas instinctively realized that he was the kind of man who could be trusted to be lenient on order or suggestion. That is, if Desmas had the least interest in a prisoner, he need scarcely say so much to Bonhag. He might merely suggest that this man was used to a different kind of life, or that, because of some past experience, it might go hard with him if he were handled roughly, and Bonhag would strain himself to be pleasant. The trouble was that to a shrewd man of any refinement, his attentions were objectionable, being obviously offered for a purpose, and to a poor or ignorant man they were brutal and contemptuous. He had built up an extra income for himself inside the prison by selling the prisoners extra allowances of things which he secretly brought into the prison. It was strictly against the rules, in theory at least, to bring in anything which was not sold in the storeroom: tobacco, writing paper, pens, ink, whiskey, cigars, or delicacies of any kind. On the other hand, and excellently well for him, it was true that tobacco of an inferior grade was provided, as well as wretched pens, ink, and paper, so that no self-respecting man, if he could help it, would endure them. Whiskey was not allowed at all, and delicacies were abhorred as indicating rank favoritism. Nevertheless, they were brought in. If a prisoner had the money and was willing to see that Bonhag secured something for his trouble, almost anything would be forthcoming. Also the privilege of being sent into the general yard as a trustee, or being allowed to stay in the little private yard which some cells possessed, longer than the half-hour ordinarily permitted, was sold. One of the things curiously enough at this time, which worked in Cowperwood's favor, was the fact that Bonhag was friendly with the overseer who had Stenner in charge, and Stenner, because of his political friends, was being liberally treated, and Bonhag knew of this. He was not a careful reader of newspapers, nor had he any intellectual grasp of important events, but he knew by now that both Stenner and Cowperwood were, or had been, individuals of great importance in the community. Also that Cowperwood had been the more important of the two. Better yet, as Bonhag now heard, Cowperwood still had money. Some prisoner, who was permitted to read the paper, told him so. And so, entirely aside from Warden Desmas' recommendation, which was given in a very quiet, non-committal way, Bonhag was interested to see what he could do for Cowperwood for a price. The day Cowperwood was installed in his new cell, Bonhag lolled up to the door, which was open, and said in a semi-patronizing way, "Got all your things over yet?" It was his business to lock the door once Cowperwood was inside it. "Yes, sir," replied Cowperwood, who had been shrewd enough to get the new overseer's name from Chapin. "This is Mr. Bonhag, I presume." "That's me," replied Bonhag, not a little flattered by the recognition, but still purely interested by the practical side of this encounter. He was anxious to study Cowperwood, to see what type of man he was. "You'll find it a little different down here from up there," observed Bonhag. "It ain't so stuffy. These doors out in the yards make a difference." "Oh, yes," said Cowperwood observantly and shrewdly. "That is the yard Mr. Desmas spoke of." At the mention of the magic name, if Bonhag had been a horse, his ears would have been seen to lift. For, of course, if Cowperwood was so friendly with Desmas that the latter had described to him the type of cell he was to have beforehand, it behooved Bonhag to be especially careful. "Yes, that's it, but it ain't much," he observed. "They only allow a half-hour a day in it. Still, it would be all right if a person could stay out there longer." This was his first hint at graft, favoritism, and Cowperwood distinctly caught the sound of it in his voice. "That's too bad," he said. "I don't suppose good conduct helps a person to get more." He waited to hear a reply, but instead Bonhag continued with, "I'd better teach you your new trade now. You've got to learn to cane chairs, so the warden says. If you want, we can begin right away." But without waiting for Cowperwood to acquiesce, he went off, returning after a time with 3 unvarnished frames of chairs and a bundle of cane strips, or withes, which he deposited on the floor. Having done so, and with a flourish, he now continued, "Now I'll show you, if you'll watch me." And he began showing Cowperwood how the strips were to be laced through the apertures on either side, cut, and fastened with little hickory pegs. This done, he brought a 4-ring-awl, a small hammer, a box of pegs, and a pair of clippers. After several brief demonstrations with different strips as to how the geometric forms were designed, he allowed Cowperwood to take the matter in hand, watching over his shoulder. The financier, quick at anything, manual or mental, went at it in his customary energetic fashion, and in 5 minutes demonstrated to Bonhag that, barring skill and speed, which could only come with practice, he could do it as well as another. "You'll make out all right,"
said Bonhag. "You're supposed to do 10 of those a day. We won't count the next few days, though, until you get your hand in. After that, I'll come around and see how you're getting along. You understand about the towel on the door, don't you?" he inquired.
"Yes, Mr. Chapin explained that to me," replied Cowperwood. "I think I know what most of the rules are now. I'll try not to break any of them." The days which followed brought a number of modifications of his prison lot, but not sufficient by any means to make it acceptable to him. Bonhag, during the first few days in which he trained Cowperwood in the art of caning chairs, managed to make it perfectly clear that there were a number of things he would be willing to do for him. One of the things that moved him to this was that already he had been impressed by the fact that Stener's friends were coming to see him in larger numbers than Cowperwood's, sending him an occasional basket of fruit, which he gave to the overseers, and that his wife and children had been already permitted to visit him outside the regular visiting day. This was a cause for jealousy on Bonhag's part. His fellow overseer was lording it over him, telling him, as it were, of the hijinks in Block 4. Bonhag really wanted Cowperwood to spruce up and show what he could do, socially or otherwise. And so now he began with, "I see you have your lawyer and your partner here every day. There ain't anybody else you'd like to have visit you, is there? Of course, it's against the rules to have your wife or sister or anybody like that, except on visiting days." And here he paused and rolled a large and informing eye on Cowperwood, such an eye as was supposed to convey dark and mysterious things. "But all the rules ain't kept around here by a long shot." Cowperwood was not the man to lose a chance of this kind. He smiled a little, enough to relieve himself, and to convey to Bonhag that he was gratified by the information, but vocally he observed, "I'll tell you how it is, Mr. Bonhag. I believe you understand my position better than most men would, and that I can talk to you. There are people who would like to come here, but I have been afraid to let them come. I did not know that it could be arranged. If it could be, I would be very grateful. You and I are practical men. I know that if any favors are extended, some of those who help to bring them about must be looked after. If you can do anything to make it a little more comfortable for me here, I will show you that I appreciate it. I haven't any money on my person, but I can always get it, and I will see that you are properly looked after." Bonhag's short, thick ears tingled. This was the kind of talk he liked to hear. "I can fix anything like that, Mr. Cowperwood," he replied servilely. "You leave it to me. If there's anyone you want to see at any time, just let me know. Of course, I have to be very careful, and so do you, but that's all right, too. If you want to stay out in that yard a little longer in the mornings, or get out there afternoons or evenings from now on, why, go ahead. It's all right. I'll just leave the door open. If the warden or anybody else should be around, I'll just scratch on your door with my key, and you come in and shut it. If there's anything you want from the outside, I can get it for you. Jelly, or eggs, or butter, or any little thing like that. You might like to fix up your meals a little that way." "I'm certainly most grateful, Mr. Bonhag," returned Cowperwood in his grandest manner, and with a desire to smile, but he kept a straight face. "In regard to that other matter," went on Bonhag, referring to the matter of extra visitors, "I can fix that any time you want. I know the men out at the gate. If you want anybody to come here, just write 'em a note and give it to me and tell 'em to ask for me when they come, and that'll get 'em in all right. When they get here, you can talk to 'em in your cell, see? Only when I tap, they have to come out. You want to remember that. So just you let me know." Cowperwood was exceedingly grateful. He said so in direct, choice language. It occurred to him at once that this was Eileen's opportunity, and that he could now notify her to come. If she veiled herself sufficiently, she would probably be safe enough. He decided to write her, and when Wingate came, he gave him a letter to mail. 2 days later, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time appointed by him, Eileen came to see him. She was dressed in gray broadcloth, with white velvet trimmings and cut steel buttons, which glistened like silver, and wore, as additional ornaments, as well as a protection against the cold, a cap, stole, and muff of snow-white ermine. Over this rather striking costume she had slipped a long, dark, circular cloak, which she meant to lay off immediately upon her arrival. She had made a very careful toilet as to her shoes, gloves, hair, and the gold ornaments which she wore. Her face was concealed by a thick green veil, as Cowperwood had suggested, and she arrived at an hour when, as near as he had been able to prearrange, he would be alone. Wingate usually came at 4 after business, and Steger in the morning, when he came at all. She was very nervous over this strange adventure, leaving the streetcar in which she had chosen to travel some distance away, and walking up a side street. The cold weather and the grey walls under a grey sky gave her a sense of defeat, but she had worked very hard to look nice in order to cheer her lover up. She knew how readily he responded to the influence of her beauty when properly displayed. Cowperwood, in view of her coming, had made his cell as acceptable as possible. It was clean, because he had swept it himself, and made his own bed, and besides he had shaved and combed his hair, and otherwise put himself to rights. The cane chairs on which he was working had been put in the corner at the end of the bed. His few dishes were washed and hung up, and his clogs brushed with a brush which he now kept for the purpose. Never before, he thought to himself, with a peculiar feeling of artistic degradation, had Eileen seen him like this. She had always admired his good taste in clothes, and the way he carried himself in them, and now she was to see him in garments which no dignity of body could make presentable. Only a stoic sense of his own soul dignity aided him here. After all, as he now thought, he was Frank A. Cowperwood, and that was something, whatever he wore. And Eileen knew it. Again, he might be free and rich some day, and he knew that she believed that. Best of all, his looks under these or any other circumstances, as he knew, would make no difference to Eileen. She would only love him the more. It was her ardent sympathy that he was afraid of. He was so glad that Bonhag had suggested that she might enter the cell, for it would be a grim procedure, talking to her through a barred door. When Eileen arrived, she asked for Mr. Bonhag, and was permitted to go to the central rotunda, where he was sent for. When he came, she murmured, "I wish to see Mr. Cowperwood, if you please." And he exclaimed, "Oh, yes, just come with me." As he came across the rotunda floor from his corridor, he was struck by the evident youth of Eileen, even though he could not see her face. This now was something in accordance with what he had expected of Cowperwood. A man who could steal $500,000 and set a whole city by the ears must have wonderful adventures of all kinds, and Eileen looked like a true adventure. He led her to the little room where he kept his desk and detained visitors, and then bustled down to Cowperwood's cell, where the financier was working on one of the chairs and scratching on the door with his key, called, "There's a young lady here to see you. Do you want to let her come inside?" "Thank you, yes," replied Cowperwood, and Bonhag hurried away, unintentionally forgetting, in his boorish incivility, to unlock the cell door, so that he had to open it in Eileen's presence. The long corridor, with its thick doors, mathematically spaced gratings, and grey stone pavement, caused Eileen to feel faint at heart. A prison, iron cells, and he was in one of them. It chilled her usually courageous spirit. What a terrible place for her Frank to be! What a horrible thing to have put him here! Judges, juries, courts, laws, jails seemed like so many foaming ogres ranged about the world, glaring down upon her and her love affair. The clank of the key in the lock, and the heavy outward swinging of the door, completed her sense of the untoward. And then she saw Cowperwood. Because of the price he was to receive, Bonhag, after admitting her, strolled discreetly away. Eileen looked at Cowperwood from behind her veil, afraid to speak until she was sure Bonhag was gone. And Cowperwood, who was retaining his self-possession by an effort, signaled her, but with difficulty after a moment or two. "It's all right," he said. "He's gone away." She lifted her veil, removed her cloak, and took in, without seeming to, the stuffy, narrow thickness of the room, his wretched shoes, the cheap, misshapen suit, the iron door behind him leading out into the little yard attached to his cell. Against such a background, with his partially caned chairs visible at the end of the bed, he seemed unnatural, weird even. Her Frank, and in this condition. She trembled, and it was useless for her to try to speak. She could only put her arms around him and stroke his head, murmuring, "My poor boy, my darling, is this what they have done to you? Oh, my poor darling." She held his head while Cowperwood, anxious to retain his composure, winced and trembled too. Her love was so full, so genuine. It was so soothing at the same time that it was unmanning, as now he could see, making of him a child again. And for the first time in his life, some inexplicable trick of chemistry, that chemistry of the body, of blind forces, which so readily supersedes reason at times, he lost his self-control. The depth of Eileen's feelings, the cooing sound of her voice, the velvety tenderness of her hands, that beauty that had drawn him all the time, more radiant here perhaps within these hard walls, and in the face of his physical misery, than it had ever seen before, completely unmanned him. He did not understand how it could. He tried to defy the moods, but he could not. When she held his head close and caressed it, of a sudden, in spite of himself, his breast felt thick and stuffy, and his throat hurt him. He felt for him an astonishingly strange feeling, a desire to cry, which he did his best to overcome. It shocked him so. There then combined and conspired to defeat him a strange, rich picture of the great world he had so recently lost, of the lovely, magnificent world which he hoped some day to regain. He felt more poignantly at this moment than he ever had before the degradation of the clogged shoes, the cotton shirt, the striped suit, the reputation of a convict, permanent and not to be laid aside. He drew himself quickly away from her, turned his back, clinched his hands, drew his muscles taut. But it was too late. He was crying, and he could not stop. "Oh, damn it!" he exclaimed, half angrily, half self-commiseratingly, in combined rage and shame. "Why should I cry? What the devil's the matter with me, anyhow?" Eileen saw it. She fairly flung herself in front of him, seized his head with one hand, his shabby waist with the other, and held him tight in a grip that he could not have readily released. "Oh, honey, honey, honey!" she exclaimed, pityingly, feverishly. "I love you. I adore you. They should cut my body into bits, if it would do you any good. To think that they should make you cry. Oh, my sweet, my darling boy." She pulled his still shaking body tighter, and with her free hand caressed his head. She kissed his eyes, his hair, his cheeks. He pulled himself loose again after a moment, exclaiming, "What the devil's got into me?" But she drew him back. "Never mind, honey, darling. Don't you be ashamed to cry. Cry here on my shoulder. Cry here with me, my baby, my honey pet." He quieted down after a few moments, cautioning her against Bonhag and regaining his former composure, which he was so ashamed to have lost. "You're a great girl, pet," he said with a tender and yet apologetic smile. "You're all right, all that I need, a great help to me. But don't worry any longer about me, dear. I'm all right. It isn't as bad as you think. How are you?" Eileen, on her part, was not to be soothed so easily. His many woes, including his wretched position here, outraged her sense of justice and decency. To think her fine, wonderful Frank should be compelled to come to this, to cry. She stroked his head tenderly, while wild, deadly, unreasoning opposition to life and chance and untoward opposition surged in her brain. Her father, damn him! Her family, pooh! What did she care? Her Frank, her Frank. How little all else mattered where he was concerned. Never, never, never would she desert him, never, come what might. And now she clung to him in silence while she fought in her brain an awful battle with life, and law, and fate, and circumstance. Law, nonsense, people, they were brutes, devils, enemies, hounds. She was delighted, eager, crazy to make a sacrifice of herself. She would go anywhere for or with her Frank now. She would do anything for him. Her family was nothing, life nothing, nothing, nothing. She would do anything he wished, nothing more, nothing less. Anything she could do to save him, to make his life happier, but nothing for anyone else. Chapter 56. The days passed. Once the understanding with Bonhag was reached, Cowperwood's wife, mother, and sister were allowed to appear on occasions. His wife and the children were now settled in that little home for which he was paying, and his financial obligations to her were satisfied by Wingate, who paid her $125 a month for him. He realized that he owed her more, but he was sailing rather close to the wind financially these days. The final collapse of his old interests had come in March, when he had been legally declared a bankrupt, and all his properties forfeited to satisfy the claims against him. The city's claim of $500,000 would have eaten up more than could have been realized at the time, had not a pro rata payment of 30 cents on the dollar been declared. Even then the city never received its due, for by some hocus-pocus it was declared to have forfeited its rights. Its claims had not been made at the proper time in the proper way. This left larger portions of real money for the others. Fortunately, by now, Cowperwood had begun to see that by a little experimenting his business relations with Wingate were likely to prove profitable. The broker had made it clear that he intended to be perfectly straight with him. He had employed Cowperwood's two brothers at very moderate salaries, one to take care of the books and look after the office, and the other to act on change with him, for their seats in that organization had never been sold. And also, by considerable effort, he had succeeded in securing Cowperwood Sr. a place as a clerk in a bank. For the latter, since the day of his resignation from the Third National, had been in a deep, sad quandary as to what further to do with his life. His son's disgrace, the horror of his trial and incarceration. Since the day of Frank's indictment, and more so, since his sentence and commitment to the Eastern Penitentiary, he was as one who walked in a dream. That trial, that charge against Frank, his own son, a convict, in stripes, and after he and Frank had walked so proudly in the front rank of the successful and respected here, like so many others in his hour of distress, he had taken to reading the Bible, looking into its pages for something of that mind consolation that always, from youth up, although rather casually in these latter years, he had imagined was to be found there. The Psalms, Isaiah, the Book of Job, Ecclesiastes, and for the most part, because of the fraying nature of his present ills, not finding it. But day after day, secreting himself in his room, a little hall-bedroom office in his newest home, where to his wife he pretended that he had some commercial matters wherewith he was still concerned, and once inside, the door locked, sitting and brooding on all that had befallen him, his losses, his good name. Or, after months of this, and because of the new position secured for him by Wingate, a bookkeeping job in one of the outlying banks, slipping away early in the morning and returning late at night, his mind a gloomy epitome of all that had been or yet might be. To see him bustling off from his new but very much reduced home at 7:30 in the morning in order to reach the small bank, which was some distance away and not accessible by streetcar line, was one of those pathetic sights which the fortunes of trade so frequently offer. He carried his lunch in a small box because it was inconvenient to return home in the time allotted for this purpose, and because his new salary did not permit the extravagance of a purchased one. It was his one ambition now to eke out a respectable but unseen existence until he should die, which he hoped would not be long. He was a pathetic figure with his thin legs and body, his grey hair, and his snow-white side whiskers. He was very lean and angular, and, when confronted by a difficult problem, a little uncertain or vague in his mind. An old habit which had grown on him in the years of his prosperity of putting his hand to his mouth and of opening his eyes in an assumption of surprise, which had no basis in fact, now grew upon him. He really degenerated, although he did not know it, into a mere automaton. Life strews its shores with such interesting and pathetic wrecks. One of the things that caused Cowperwood so little thought at the time, and especially in view of his present extreme indifference to her, was how he would bring up this matter of his indifference to his wife and his desire to end their relationship. Yet apart from the brutality of the plain truth, he saw no way. As he could plainly see, she was now persisting in her pretense of devotion, uncolored, apparently, by any suspicion of what had happened. Yet since his trial and conviction, she had been hearing from one source and another that he was still intimate with Eileen, and it was only her thought of his concurrent woes, and the fact that he might possibly be spared to a successful financial life, that now deterred her from speaking. He was shut up in a cell, she said to herself, and she was really very sorry for him, but she did not love him as she once had. He was really too deserving of reproach for his general unseemly conduct, and no doubt this was what was intended, as well as being enforced by the governing power of the world. One can imagine how much such an attitude as this would appeal to Cowperwood, once he had detected it, by a dozen little signs in spite of the fact that she brought him delicacies and commiserated on his fate. He could see that she felt not only sad but reproachful, and if there was one thing that Cowperwood objected to at all times, it was the moral as well as the funereal air. Contrasted with the cheerful, combative hopefulness and enthusiasm of Eileen, the wearied uncertainty of Mrs. Cowperwood was, to say the least, a little tame. Eileen, after her first burst of rage over his fate, which really did not develop any tears on her part, was apparently convinced that he would get out and be very successful again. She talked success and his future all the time, because she believed in it. Instinctively she seemed to realize that prison walls could not make a prison for him. Indeed, on the first day she left, she handed Bonhag $10, and after thanking him in her attractive voice, without showing her face, however, for his obvious kindness to her, bespoke his further favor for Cowperwood, a very great man, as she described him, which sealed that ambitious materialist's fate completely. There was nothing the overseer would not do for the young lady in the dark cloak. She might have stayed in Cowperwood's cell for a week if the visiting hours of the penitentiary had not made it impossible. The day that Cowperwood decided to discuss with his wife the weariness of his present married state and his desire to be free of it was some 4 months after he had entered the prison. By that time he had become inured to his convict life. The silence of his cell and the menial tasks he was compelled to perform, which had at first been so distressing, banal, maddening in their pointless iteration, had now become merely commonplace. Dull, but not painful. Furthermore, he had learned many of the little resources of the solitary convict, such as that of using his lamp to warm up some delicacy which he had saved from a previous meal, or from some basket which had been sent him by his wife or Eileen. He had partially gotten rid of the sickening odor of his cell by persuading Bonhag to bring him small packages of lime, which he used with great freedom. Also, he succeeded in defeating some of the more venturesome rats with traps, and with Bonhag's permission, after his cell door had been properly locked at night and sealed with the outer wooden door, he would take his chair, if it were not too cold, out into the little backyard of his cell and look at the sky, where, when the nights were clear, the stars were to be seen. He had never taken any interest in astronomy as a scientific study, but now the Pleiades, the belt of Orion, the Big Dipper, and the North Star, to which one of its lines pointed, caught his attention, almost his fancy. He wondered why the stars of the belt of Orion came to assume the peculiar mathematical relation to each other which they held, as far as distance and arrangement were concerned, and whether that could possibly have any intellectual significance. The nebulous conglomeration of the suns in Pleiades suggested a soundless depth of space, and he thought of the earth floating like a little ball in immeasurable reaches of ether. His own life appeared very trivial in view of these things, and he found himself asking whether it was all really of any significance or importance. He shook these moods off with ease, however, for the man was possessed of a sense of grandeur, largely in relation to himself and his affairs, and his temperament was essentially material and vital. Something kept telling him that whatever his present state, he must yet grow to be a significant personage, one whose fame would be heralded the world over, who must try. It was not given all men to see far or to do brilliantly, but to him it was given, and he must be what he was cut out to be. There was no more escaping the greatness that was inherent in him than there was for so many others the littleness that was in them. Mrs. Cowperwood came in that afternoon quite solemnly, bearing several changes of linen, a pair of sheets, some potted meat, and a pie. She was not exactly doleful, but Cowperwood thought that she was tending toward it, largely because of her brooding over his relationship to Eileen, which he knew that she knew. Something in her manner decided him to speak before she left, and after asking her how the children were, and listening to her inquiries in regard to the things that he needed, he said to her, sitting on his single chair while she sat on his bed, "Lillian, there's something I've been wanting to talk with you about for some time. I should have done it before, but it's better late than never. I know that there is something between Eileen Butler and me, and we might as well have it open and above board. It's true I am very fond of her, and she is very devoted to me, and if ever I get out of here I want to arrange it so that I can marry her. That means that you will have to give me a divorce, if you will, and I want to talk to you about that now. This can't be so very much of a surprise to you, because you must have seen this long while that our relationship hasn't been all that it might have been, and under the circumstances, this can't prove such a very great hardship to you, I am sure." He paused, waiting, for Mrs. Cowperwood at first said nothing. Her thought, when he first broached this, was that she ought to make some demonstration of astonishment or wrath, but when she looked into his steady, examining eyes, so free from the illusion of or interest in demonstrations of any kind, she realized how useless it would be. He was so utterly matter-of-fact in what seemed to her quite private and secret affairs, very shameless. She had never been able to understand quite how he could take the subtleties of life as he did, anyhow. Certain things which she always fancied should be hushed up, he spoke of with the greatest nonchalance. Her ears tingled sometimes at his frankness in disposing of a social situation, but she thought this must be characteristic of notable men, and so there was nothing to be said about it. Certain men did as they pleased. Society did not seem to be able to deal with them in any way. Perhaps God would later. She was not sure. Anyhow, bad as he was, direct as he was, forceful as he was far more interesting than most of the more conservative types, in whom the social virtues of polite speech and modest thoughts were seemingly predominant. "I know," she said rather peacefully, although with a touch of anger and resentment in her voice. "I've known all about it all this time. I expected you would say something like this to me some day. It's a nice reward for all my devotion to you, but it's just like you, Frank. When you are set on something, nothing can stop you. It wasn't enough that you were getting along so nicely and had 2 children whom you ought to love, but you had to take up with this Butler creature until her name and yours are a byword throughout the city. I know that she comes to this prison. I saw her out here one day as I was coming in, and I suppose everyone else knows it by now. She has no sense of decency, and she does not care, the wretched, vain thing, but I would have thought that you would be ashamed, Frank, to go on the way that you have, when you still have me and the children and your father and mother, and when you are certain to have such a hard fight to get yourself on your feet as it is. If she had any sense of decency, she would not have anything to do with you, the shameless thing." Cowperwood looked at his wife with unflinching eyes. He read in her remarks just what his observation had long since confirmed, that she was sympathetically out of touch with him. She was no longer so attractive physically, and intellectually she was not Eileen's equal. Also, that contact with those women who had deigned to grace his home in his greatest hour of prosperity had proved to him conclusively she was lacking in certain social graces. Eileen was by no means so vastly better. Still, she was young and amenable and adaptable, and could still be improved. Opportunity, as he now chose to think, might make Eileen, whereas for Lillian, or at least as he now saw it, it could do nothing. "I'll tell you how it is, Lillian," he said. "I'm not sure that you are going to get what I mean exactly, but you and I are not at all well suited to each other any more." "You didn't seem to think that 3 or 4 years ago," interrupted his wife bitterly. "I married you when I was 21, went on Cowperwood, quite brutally, not paying any attention to her interruption. "And I was really too young to know what I was doing. I was a mere boy. It doesn't make so much difference about that. I am not using that as an excuse. The point that I am trying to make is this, that right or wrong, important or not important, I have changed my mind since. I don't love you anymore, and I don't feel that I want to keep up a relationship, however it may look to the public, that is not satisfactory to me. You have one point of view about life, and I have another. You think your point of view is the right one, and there are thousands of people who will agree with you, but I don't think so. We have never quarreled about these things, because I didn't think it was important to quarrel about them. I don't see under the circumstances that I am doing you any great injustice when I ask you to let me go. I don't intend to desert you or the children. You will get a good living income from me as long as I have the money to give it to you, but I want my personal freedom when I come out of here, if ever I do, and I want you to let me have it. The money that you had, and a great deal more once I'm out of here, you will get back when I am on my feet again. But not if you oppose me, only if you help me. I want and intend to help you always, but in my way." He smoothed the leg of his prison trousers in a thoughtful way, and plucked at the sleeve of his coat. Just now he looked very much like a highly intelligent workman as he sat here, rather than like the important personage that he was. Mrs. Cowperwood was very resentful. "That's a nice way to talk to me, and a nice way to treat me," she exclaimed dramatically, rising and walking the short space, some 2 steps, that lay between the wall and the bed. "I might have known that you were too young to know your own mind when you married me. Money, of course, that's all you think of, and your own gratification. I don't believe you have any sense of justice in you. I don't believe you ever had. You only think of yourself, Frank. I never saw such a man as you. You have treated me like a dog all through this affair, and all the while you have been running with that little snip of an Irish thing, and telling her all about your affairs, I suppose. You let me go on believing that you cared for me up to the last moment, and then you suddenly step up and tell me that you want a divorce. I'll not do it. I'll not give you a divorce, and you needn't think it." Cowperwood listened in silence. His position, in so far as this marital tangle was concerned, as he saw, was very advantageous. He was a convict, constrained by the exigencies of his position to be out of personal contact with his wife for a long period of time to come, which should naturally tend to school her to do without him. When he came out, it would be very easy for her to get a divorce from a convict, particularly if she could allege misconduct with another woman, which he would not deny. At the same time, he hoped to keep Eileen's name out of it. Mrs. Cowperwood, if she would, could give any false name if he made no contest. Besides, she was not a very strong person, intellectually speaking. He could bend her to his will. There was no need of saying much more now. The ice had been broken, the situation had been put before her, and time should do the rest. "Don't be dramatic, Lillian," he commented indifferently. "I'm not such a loss to you if you have enough to live on. I don't think I want to live in Philadelphia if ever I come out of here. My idea now is to go west, and I think I want to go alone. I shan't get married right away again, even if you do give me a divorce. I don't care to take anybody along. It would be better for the children if you would stay here and divorce me. The public would think better of them and you." "I'll not do it," declared Mrs. Cowperwood emphatically. "I'll never do it, never. So there. You can say what you choose. You owe it to me to stick by me and the children after all I've done for you, and I'll not do it. You needn't ask me any more. I'll not do it." "Very well," replied Cowperwood quietly, getting up. "We needn't talk about it any more now. Your time is nearly up anyhow. 20 minutes was supposed to be the regular allotment for visitors. Perhaps you'll change your mind sometime." She gathered up her muff and the shawl strap in which she had carried her gifts, and turned to go. It had been her custom to kiss Cowperwood in a make-believe way up to this time, but now she was too angry to make this pretense. And yet she was sorry, too. Sorry for herself and, she thought, for him. "Frank," she declared dramatically at the last moment, "I never saw such a man as you. I don't believe you have any heart. You're not worthy of a good wife. You're worthy of just such a woman as you're getting. The idea!" Suddenly tears came to her eyes, and she flounced scornfully and yet sorrowfully out. Cowperwood stood there, At least there would be no more useless kissing between them, he congratulated himself. It was hard in a way, but purely from an emotional point of view. He was not doing her any essential injustice, he reasoned, not an economic one, which was the important thing. She was angry today, but she would get over it, and in time might come to see his point of view. Who could tell? At any rate, he had made it plain to her what he intended to do, and that was something as he saw it. He reminded one of nothing so much as he stood there, as of a young chicken picking its way out of the shell of an old estate. Although he was in a cell of a penitentiary, with nearly 4 years more to serve, yet obviously he felt within himself that the whole world was still before him. He could go west if he could not re-establish himself in Philadelphia, but he must stay here long enough to win the approval of those who had known him formerly, to obtain, as it were, a letter of credit which he could carry to other parts. "Hard words break no bones," he said to himself, as his wife went out. "A man's never done till he's done. I'll show some of these people yet." A bonhag who came to close the cell door, he asked whether it was going to rain. It looked so dark in the hall. "It's sure to before night," replied Bonhag, who was always wondering over Cowperwood's tangled affairs as he heard them retailed here and there. Chapter 57. The time that Cowperwood spent in the Eastern Penitentiary of Pennsylvania was exactly 13 months from the day of his entry to his discharge. The influences which brought about this result were partly of his willing and partly not. For one thing, some 6 months after his incarceration, Edward Malia Butler expired sitting in his chair in his private office at his home. The conduct of Eileen had been a great strain on him. From the time Cowperwood had been sentenced, and more particularly after the time he had cried on Eileen's shoulder in prison, she had turned on her father in an almost brutal way. Her attitude, unnatural for a child, was quite explicable as that of a tortured sweetheart. Cowperwood had told her that he thought Butler was using his influence to withhold a pardon for him, even though one were granted to Stenner, whose life in prison he had been following with considerable interest, and this had enraged her beyond measure. She lost no chance of being practically insulting to her father, ignoring him on every occasion, refusing as often as possible to eat at the same table, and when she did, sitting next to her mother in the place of Nora, with whom she managed to exchange. She refused to sing or play any more when he was present, and persistently ignored the large number of young political aspirants who came to the house, and whose presence, in a way, had been encouraged for her benefit. Old Butler realized, of course, what it was all about. He said nothing. He could not placate her. Her mother and brothers did not understand it all, at first. Mrs. Butler never understood.
But not long after Cowperwood's incarceration, Callum and Owen became aware of what the trouble was.
Once, when Owen was coming away from a reception at one of the houses where his growing financial importance made him welcome, he heard one of the two men whom he knew casually say to the other, as they stood at the door adjusting their coats, "You saw where this fellow Cowperwood got 4 years, didn't you?" "Yes," replied the other. "A clever devil, that, wasn't he? I knew that girl he was with, too. You know who I mean, Miss Butler. Wasn't that her name?" Owen was not sure he had heard right. He did not get the connection until the other guest, opening the door and stepping out, remarked, "Well, old Butler got even, apparently. They say he sent him up." Owen's brow clouded. A hard, contentious look came into his eyes. He had much of his father's force. What in the devil were they talking about? What Miss Butler did they have in mind? Could this be Eileen or Nora? And how could Cowperwood come to be in with either of them? It could not possibly be Nora, he reflected. She was very much infatuated with a young man whom he knew, and was going to marry him. Eileen had been most friendly with the Cowperwoods, and had often spoken well of the Financier. Could it be she? He could not believe it. He thought once of overtaking the two acquaintances and demanding to know what they meant, but when he came out on the step, they were already some distance down the street, and in the opposite direction from that in which he wished to go. He decided to ask his father about this. On demand, old Butler confessed at once, but insisted that his son keep silent about it. "I wish I'd have known," said Owen grimly. "I'd have shot that dirty dog." "Easy, easy," said Butler. "Your own life's worth more than his, and you'd only be dragging the rest of your family in the dirt with him. He's had something to pay him for his dirty trick, and he'll have more. Just you say nothing to no one. Wait, he'll be one to get out in a year or two. Say nothing to her either. Talking won't help there. She'll come to her senses when he's been away long enough, I'm thinking." Owen had tried to be civil to his sister after that, but since he was a stickler for social perfection and advancement, and so eager to get up in the world himself, he could not understand how she could possibly have done any such thing. He resented bitterly the stumbling block she had put in his path. Now, among other things, his enemies would have this to throw in his face if they wanted to, and they would want to trust life for that.
Callum reached his knowledge of the matter in quite another manner, but at about the same time. He was a member of an athletic club which had an attractive building in the city, and a fine country club, where he went occasionally to enjoy the swimming pool and the Turkish bath connected with it. One of his friends approached him there in the billiard-room one evening and said, "Say, Butler, you know I'm a good friend of yours, don't you?" "Why, certainly, I know it," replied Callum. "What's the matter?" "Well, you know," said the young individual, whose name was Richard Pethick, looking at Callum with a look of almost strained affection, "I wouldn't come to you with any story that I thought would hurt your feelings, or that you oughtn't to know about, but I do think you ought to know about this." He pulled at a high white collar, which was choking his neck. "I know you wouldn't, Pethick," replied Callum, very much interested. "What is it? What's the point?" "Well, I don't like to say anything," replied Pethick, "but that fella Hibbs is saying things around here about your sister." "What's that?" exclaimed Callum, straightening up in the most dynamic way and bethinking himself of the approved social procedure in all such cases. He should be very angry. He should demand and exact proper satisfaction in some form or other, by blows very likely, if his honor had been in any way impugned. "What is it he says about my sister? What right has he to mention her name here anyhow? He doesn't know her." Pethick affected to be greatly concerned lest he cause trouble between Callum and Hibbs. He protested that he did not want to, when, in reality, he was dying to tell. At last he came out with, "Why, he circulated the yarn that your sister has something to do with this man Cowperwood, who was tried here recently, and that's why he's just gone to prison." "What's that?" exclaimed Callum, losing the make-believe of the unimportant and taking on the serious mien of someone who feels desperately. "He says that, does he? Well, where is he? I want to see if he'll say that to me." Some of the stern fighting ability of his father showed in his slender, rather refined young face. "Now, Callum," insisted Pethick, realizing the genuine storm he had raised, and being a little fearful of the result, "do be careful what you say. You mustn't have a row in here. You know it's against the rules. Besides, he may be drunk. It's just some foolish talk he's heard, I'm sure. Now, for goodness sake, don't get excited." Pethick, having evoked the storm, was not a little nervous as to its results in his own case. He, too, as well as Callum himself, as the tale-bearer, might now be involved. But Callum by now was not so easily restrained. His face was quite pale, and he was moving toward the old English grill-room, where Hibbs happened to be, consuming a brandy and soda with a friend of about his own age. Callum entered and called him. "Oh, Hibbs," he said. Hibbs, hearing his voice and seeing him in the door, arose and came over. He was an interesting youth of the collegiate type, educated at Princeton. He had heard the rumor concerning Eileen from various sources, other members of the club, for one, and had ventured to repeat it in Pethick's presence. "What's that you were just saying about my sister?" asked Callum grimly, looking Hibbs in the eye. "Why, I—" hesitated Hibbs, who sensed trouble and was eager to avoid it. He was not exceptionally brave, and looked it. His hair was straw-colored, his eyes blue, and his cheeks pink. "Why, nothing in particular. Who said I was talking about her?" He looked at Pethick, whom he knew to be the tale-bearer, and the latter exclaimed excitedly, "Now don't you try to deny it, Hibbs. You know I heard you." "Well, what did I say?" asked Hibbs defiantly. "Well, what did you say?" interrupted Callum grimly, transferring the conversation to himself. "That's just what I want to know." "Why," stammered Hibbs nervously, "I don't think I've said anything that anybody else hasn't said. I just repeated that someone said that your sister had been very friendly with Mr. Cowperwood. I didn't say any more than I have heard other people say around here." "Oh, you didn't, did you?" exclaimed Callum, withdrawing his hand from his pocket and slapping Hibbs in the face. He repeated the blow with his left hand, fiercely. "Perhaps that'll teach you to keep my sister's name out of your mouth, you pup." Hibbs' arms flew up. He was not without pugilistic training, and he struck back vigorously, striking Callum once in the chest and once in the neck. In an instant the 2 rooms of this suite were in an uproar. Tables and chairs were overturned by the energy of men attempting to get to the scene of action. The 2 combatants were quickly separated. Sides were taken by the friends of each, excited explanations attempted and defied. Callum was examining the knuckles of his left hand, which were cut from the blow he had delivered. He maintained a gentlemanly calm. Hibbs, very much flustered and excited, insisted that he had been most unreasonably used. The idea of attacking him here. And anyhow, as he maintained now, Pethick had been both eavesdropping and lying about him. Incidentally, the latter was protesting to others that he had done the only thing which an honorable friend could do. It was 9 days' wonder in the club, and was only kept out of the newspapers by the most strenuous efforts on the part of the friends of both parties. Callum was so outraged on discovering that there was some foundation for the rumor at the club, in a general rumor which prevailed, that he tendered his resignation and never went there again. "I wish to heaven you hadn't struck that fellow," counselled Owen when the incident was related to him. "It will only make more talk. She ought to leave this place, but she won't. She's struck on that fellow yet, and we can't tell Nora and Mother. We will never hear the last of this, you and I, believe me."
"Damn it, she ought to be made to go,"
exclaimed Callum. "Well, she won't," replied Owen. "Father has tried making her, and she won't go. Just let things stand. He's in the penitentiary now, and that's probably the end of him. The public seem to think that Father put him there, and that's something. Maybe we can persuade her to go after a while. I wish to God we had never had sight of that fellow. If ever he comes out, I've a good notion to kill him." "Oh, I wouldn't do anything like that," replied Callum. "It's useless. It would only stir things up afresh. He's done for anyhow." They planned to urge Nora to marry as soon as possible, and as for their feelings toward Eileen, it was a very chilly atmosphere which Mrs. Butler contemplated from now on, much to her confusion, grief, and astonishment. In this divided world it was that Butler eventually found himself, all at sea as to what to think or what to do. He had brooded so long now, for months, and as yet had found no solution. And finally, in a form of religious despair, sitting at his desk, in his business chair, he had collapsed, a weary and disconsolate man of 70. A lesion of the left ventricle was the immediate physical cause, although brooding over Eileen was in part the mental one. His death could not have been laid to his grief over Eileen exactly, for he was a very large man, apoplectic and with sclerotic veins and arteries. For a great many years now he had taken very little exercise, and his digestion had been considerably impaired thereby. He was past 70, and his time had been reached. They found him there the next morning, his hands folded in his lap, his head on his bosom, quite cold. He was buried with honors out of St. Timothy's Church, the funeral attended by a large body of politicians and city officials, who discussed secretly among themselves whether his grief over his daughter had anything to do with his end. All his good deeds were remembered, of course, and Mollenhauer and Simpson sent great floral emblems in remembrance. They were very sorry that he was gone, for they had been a cordial three, but gone he was, and that ended their interest in the matter. He left all of his property to his wife in one of the shortest wills ever recorded locally. "I give and bequeath to my beloved wife, Nora, all my property of whatsoever kind to be disposed of as she may see fit." There was no misconstruing this. A private paper drawn secretly for her some time before by Butler explained how the property should be disposed of by her at her death. It was Butler's real will masquerading as hers, and she would not have changed it for worlds. But he wanted her left in undisturbed possession of everything until she should die. Eileen's originally assigned portion had never been changed. According to her father's will, which no power under the sun could have made Mrs. Butler alter, she was left $250,000, to be paid at Mrs. Butler's death. Neither this fact nor any of the others contained in the paper were communicated by Mrs. Butler, who retained it to be left as her will. Eileen often wondered, but never sought to know, what had been left her. Nothing, she fancied, but felt that she could not help this. Butler's death led at once to a great change in the temper of the home. After the funeral, the family settled down to a seemingly peaceful continuance of the old life, but it was a matter of seeming merely. The situation stood with Callum and Owen manifesting a certain degree of contempt for Eileen, which she, understanding, reciprocated. She was very haughty. Owen had plans of forcing her to leave after Butler's death, but he finally asked himself what was the use. Mrs. Butler, who did not want to leave the old home, was very fond of Eileen, so therein lay a reason for letting her remain. Besides, any move to force her out would have entailed an explanation to her mother, which was not deemed advisable. Owen himself was interested in Caroline Mollenhauer, whom he hoped some day to marry, as much for her prospective wealth as for any other reason, though he was quite fond of her. In the January following Butler's death, which occurred in August, Nora was married very quietly, and the following spring Callum embarked on a similar venture. In the meanwhile, with Butler's death, the control of the political situation had shifted considerably. A certain Tom Collins, formerly one of Butler's henchmen, but latterly a power in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th wards, where he had numerous saloons and control of other forms of vice, appeared as a claimant for political recognition. Mollenhauer and Simpson had to consult him, as he could make very uncertain the disposition of some 115,000 votes, a large number of which were fraudulent, but which fact did not modify their deadly character on occasion. Butler's sons disappeared as possible political factors, and were compelled to confine themselves to the street railway and contracting business. The pardon of Cowperwood and Stenner, which Butler would have opposed, because by keeping Stenner in he kept Cowperwood in, became a much easier matter. The scandal of the Treasury defalcation was gradually dying down. The newspapers had ceased to refer to it in any way. Through Steger and Wingate, a large petition signed by all important financiers and brokers had been sent to the governor pointing out that Cowperwood's trial and conviction had been most unfair and asking that he be pardoned. There was no need of any such effort, so far as Stenner was concerned. Whenever the time seemed ripe, the politicians were quite ready to say to the governor that he ought to let him go. It was only because Butler had opposed Cowperwood's release that they had hesitated. It was really not possible to let out the one and ignore the other, and this petition, coupled with Butler's death, cleared the way very nicely. Nevertheless, nothing was done until the March following Butler's death, when both Stenner and Cowperwood had been incarcerated 13 months, a length of time which seemed quite sufficient to appease the anger of the public at large. In this period, Stenner had undergone a considerable change physically and mentally. In spite of the fact that a number of the minor aldermen, who had profited in various ways by his largesse, called to see him occasionally, and that he had been given, as it were, almost the liberty of the place, and that his family had not been allowed to suffer, nevertheless he realized that his political and social days were over. Somebody might now occasionally send him a basket of fruit, and assure him that he would not be compelled to suffer much longer. But when he did get out, he knew that he had nothing to depend on save his experience as an insurance agent and real estate dealer. That had been precarious enough in the days when he was trying to get some small political foothold. How would it be when he was known only as the man who had looted the treasury of $500,000 and been sent to the penitentiary for 5 years? Who would lend him the money wherewith to get a little start, even so much as $4,000 or $5,000? The people who were calling to pay their respects now and then, and to assure him that he had been badly treated? Never. All of them could honestly claim that they had not so much to spare. If he had good security to offer, yes, but if he had good security, he would not need to go to them at all. The man who would have actually helped him if he had only known was Frank A. Cowperwood. Stenner could have confessed his mistake, as Cowperwood saw it, and Cowperwood would have given him the money gladly, without any thought of return. But by his poor understanding of human nature, Stenner considered that Cowperwood must be an enemy of his, and he would not have had either the courage or the business judgment to approach him. During his incarceration, Cowperwood had been slowly accumulating a little money through Wingate. He had paid Steger considerable sums from time to time, until that worthy finally decided that it would not be fair to take any more. "If ever you get on your feet, Frank," he said, "you can remember me if you want to, but I don't think you'll want to. It's been nothing but lose, lose, lose for you through me. I'll undertake this matter of getting that appeal to the governor without any charge on my part. Anything I can do for you from now on is free gratis for nothing." "Oh, don't talk nonsense, Harper," replied Cowperwood. "I don't know of anybody that could have done better with my case. Certainly there isn't anybody that I would have trusted as much. I don't like lawyers, you know." "Yes, well," said Steger, "they've got nothing on financiers, so we'll call it even." And they shook hands. So when it was finally decided to pardon Stenner, which was in the early part of March, 1873, Cowperwood's pardon was necessarily but gingerly included. A delegation consisting of Strobick, Harmon, and Winpenny, representing, as it was indeed to appear, the unanimous wishes of the council and the city administration, and speaking for Mollenhauer and Simpson, who had given their consent, visited the governor at Harrisburg and made the necessary formal representations which were intended to impress the public. At the same time, through the agency of Steger, Davison, and Walter Lee, the appeal in behalf of Cowperwood was made. The governor, who had had instructions beforehand from sources quite superior to this committee, was very solemn about the whole procedure. He would take the matter under advisement. He would look into the history of the crimes and the records of the two men. He would make no promises. He would see. But in 10 days, after allowing the petitions to gather considerable dust in one of his pigeonholes, and doing absolutely nothing toward investigating anything, he issued 2 separate pardons in writing. One, as a matter of courtesy, he gave into the hands of Messrs. Strobick, Harmon, and Winpenny, to bear personally to Mr. Stenner, as they desired that he should. The other, on Steger's request, he gave to him. The 2 committees which had called to receive them then departed, and the afternoon of that same day saw Strobick, Harmon, and Winpenny arrive in one group, and Steger, Wingate, and Walter Lee in another, at the prison gate, but at different hours.
Chapter 58. This matter of the pardon of Cowperwood, the exact time of it, was kept a secret from him, though the fact that he was to be pardoned soon, or that he had a very excellent chance of being, had not been denied, rather had been made much of from time to time. Wingate had kept him accurately informed as to the progress being made, as had Steger. But when it was actually ascertained, from the governor's private secretary, that a certain day would see the pardon handed over to them, Steger, Wingate, and Walter Lee had agreed between themselves that they would say nothing, taking Cowperwood by surprise. They even went so far, that is, Steger and Wingate did, as to indicate to Cowperwood that there was some hitch to the proceedings, and that he might not now get out so soon. Cowperwood was somewhat depressed, but properly stoical. He assured himself that he could wait, and that he would be all right sometime. He was rather surprised, therefore, one Friday afternoon, to see Wingate, Steger, and Lee appear at his cell door, accompanied by Warden Desmas. The warden was quite pleased to think that Cowperwood should finally be going out. He admired him so much, and decided to come along to the cell to see how he would take his liberation. On the way, Desmas commented on the fact that he had always been a model prisoner. "He kept a little garden out there in that yard of his," he confided to Walter Lee. "He had violets and pansies and geraniums out there, and they did very well, too." Lee smiled. It was like Cowperwood to be industrious and tasteful, even in prison. Such a man could not be conquered. "A very remarkable man, that," he remarked to Desmas. "Very," replied the warden. "You can tell that by looking at him." The four looked in through the barred door, where he was working, without being observed, having come up quite silently. "Hard at it, Frank?" asked Steger. Cowperwood glanced over his shoulder and got up. He had been thinking, as always these days, of what he would do when he did get out. "What is this?" he asked. "A political delegation?" He suspected something on the instant. All four smiled cheeringly, and Bonhag unlocked the door for the warden. "Nothing very much, Frank," replied Steger gleefully. "Only you're a free man. You can gather up your traps and come right along, if you wish." Cowperwood surveyed his friends with a level gaze. He had not expected this so soon after what had been told him. He was not one to be very much interested in the practical joke or the surprise, but this pleased him, the sudden realization that he was free. Still, he had anticipated it so long that the charm of it had been discounted to a certain extent. He had been unhappy here, and he had not. The shame and the humiliation of it, to begin with, had been much. Latterly, as he had become inured to it all, the sense of narrowness and humiliation had worn off. Only the consciousness of incarceration and delay irked him. Barring his intense desire for certain things, success and vindication principally, he found that he could live in a narrow cell and be fairly comfortable. He had long since become used to the limey smell, used to defeat a more sickening one, and to the numerous rats which he quite regularly trapped. He had learned to take an interest in chair caning, having become so proficient that he could see 20 in a day if he chose, and in working in the little garden in spring, summer, and fall. Every evening he had studied the sky from his narrow yard, which resulted curiously in the gift in later years of a great reflecting telescope to a famous university. He had not looked upon himself as an ordinary prisoner, by any means, had not felt himself to be sufficiently punished if a real crime had been involved. From Bonhag he had learned the history of many criminals here incarcerated, from murderers up and down, and many had been pointed out to him from time to time. He had been escorted into the general yard by Bonhag, had seen the general food of the place being prepared, had heard of Stenner's modified life here, and so forth. It had finally struck him that it was not so bad, only that the delay to an individual like himself was wasteful. He could do so much now if he were out and did not have to fight court proceedings, courts and jails. He shook his head when he thought of the waste involved in them. "That's all right," he said, looking around him in an uncertain way. "I'm ready." He stepped out into the hall with scarcely a farewell glance, and to Bonhag, who was grieving greatly over the loss of so profitable a customer, he said, "I wish you would see that some of these things are sent over to my house, Walter. You're welcome to the chair, that clock, this mirror, those pictures, all of these things, in fact, except my linen, razors, and so forth." The last little act of beneficence soothing Bonhag's lacerated soul a little. They went out into the receiving overseer's office, where Cowperwood laid aside his prison suit and the soft shirt with a considerable sense of relief. The clogged shoes had long since been replaced by a better pair of his own. He put on the derby hat and gray overcoat he had worn the year before on entering, and expressed himself as ready. At the entrance of the prison, he turned and looked back, one last glance, at the iron door leading into the garden. "You don't regret leaving that, do you, Frank?" asked Steger curiously. "I do not," replied Cowperwood. "It wasn't that I was thinking of. It was just the appearance of it, that's all." In another minute they were at the outer gate, where Cowperwood shook the warden finally by the hand. Then, entering a carriage outside the large, impressive Gothic entrance, the gates were locked behind them, and they were driven away. "Well, there's an end of that, Frank," observed Steger gaily. "That will never bother you any more." "Yes," replied Cowperwood. "It's worse to see it coming than going." "It seems to me we ought to celebrate this occasion in some way," observed Walter Lee. "It won't do just to take Frank home. Why don't we all go down to Green's? That's a good idea." "I'd rather not, if you don't mind," replied Cowperwood feelingly. "I'll get together with you all later. Just now I'd like to go home and change these clothes." He was thinking of Eileen and his children and his mother and father and of his whole future. Life was going to broaden out for him considerably from now on. He was sure of it. He had learned so much about taking care of himself in those 13 months. He was going to see Eileen and find how she felt about things in general, and then he was going to resume some such duties as he had had in his own concern with Wingate and Company. He was going to secure a seat on 'Change again through his friends, and to escape the effect of the prejudice of those who might not care to do business with an ex-convict, he was going to act as general outside man and floor man on charge for Wingate and Company. His practical control of that could not be publicly proved. Now, for some important development in the market, some slump or something, he would show the world whether he was a failure or not. They let him down in front of his wife's little cottage, and he entered briskly in the gathering gloom. On September 18th, 1873, at 12:15 of a brilliant autumn day, in the city of Philadelphia, one of the most startling financial tragedies that the world has ever seen had its commencement. The banking house of J. Cook & Company, the foremost financial organization of America, doing business at number 114 South 3rd Street in Philadelphia, and with branches in New York, Washington, and London, closed its doors. Those who know anything about the financial crises of the United States know well the significance of the panic which followed. It is spoken of in all histories as the Panic of 1873, and the widespread ruin and disaster which followed was practically unprecedented in American history. At this time Cowperwood, once more a broker, ostensibly a broker's agent, was doing business in South 3rd Street and representing Wingate and Company on 'Change. During the 6 months which had elapsed since he had emerged from the Eastern Penitentiary, he had been quietly resuming financial, if not social, relations with those who had known him before. Furthermore, Wingate and Company were prospering, and had been for some time, a fact which redounded to his credit with those who knew. Ostensibly he lived with his wife in a small house on North 21st Street. In reality, he occupied a bachelor apartment on North 15th Street, to which Eileen occasionally repaired. The difference between himself and his wife had now become a matter of common knowledge in the family, and although there were some faint efforts made to smooth the matter over, no good resulted. The difficulties of the past 2 years had so inured his parents to expect the untoward and exceptional that, astounding as this was, it did not shock them so much as it would have years before. They were too much frightened by life to quarrel with its weird developments. They could only hope and pray for the best. The Butler family, on the other hand, what there was of it, had become indifferent to Eileen's conduct. She was ignored by her brothers and Nora, who now knew all, and her mother was so taken up with religious devotions and brooding contemplations of her loss that she was not as active in her observation of Eileen's life as she might have been. Besides, Cowperwood and his mistress were more circumspect in their conduct than they had ever been before. Their movements were more carefully guarded, though the result was the same. Cowperwood was thinking of the West, of reaching some slight local standing here in Philadelphia, and then, with perhaps $100,000 in capital, removing to the boundless prairies of which he had heard so much. Chicago, Fargo, Duluth, Sioux City, places then heralded in Philadelphia and the East as coming centers of great life, and taking Eileen with him. Although the problem of marriage with her was insoluble unless Mrs. Cowperwood should formally agree to give him up, a possibility which was not manifest at this time, neither he nor Eileen were deterred by that thought. They were going to build a future together, or so they thought, marriage or no marriage. The only thing which Cowperwood could see to do was to take Eileen away with him, and to trust to time and absence to modify his wife's point of view. This particular panic, which was destined to mark a notable change in Cowperwood's career, was one of those peculiar things which spring naturally out of the optimism of the American people and the irrepressible progress of the country. It was the result, to be accurate, of the prestige and ambition of J. Cook, whose early training and subsequent success had all been acquired in Philadelphia, and who had since become the foremost financial figure of his day. It would be useless to attempt to trace here the rise of this man to distinction. It need only be said that by suggestions which he made and methods which he devised, the Union government, in its darkest hours, was able to raise the money wherewith to continue the struggle against the South. After the Civil War, this man, who had built up tremendous banking business in Philadelphia, with great branches in New York and Washington, was at a loss for some time for some significant thing to do, some constructive work which would be worthy of his genius. The war was over. The only thing which remained was the finances of peace, and the greatest things in American financial enterprise were those related to the construction of transcontinental railway lines. The Union Pacific, authorized in 1860, was already building. The Northern Pacific and the Southern Pacific were already dreams in various pioneer minds. The great thing was to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific by steel, to bind up the territorially perfected and newly solidified Union, or to enter upon some vast project of mining, of which gold and silver were the most important. Actually, railway building was the most significant of all, and railroad stocks were far and away the most valuable and important on every exchange in America. Here in Philadelphia, New York Central, Rock Island, Wabash, Central Pacific, St. Paul, Hannibal and St. Joseph, Union Pacific, and Ohio and Mississippi were freely traded in. There were men who were getting rich and famous out of handling these things, and such towering figures as Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Daniel Drew, James Fish, and others in the East, and Fair, Crocker, W.R. Hearst, and Collins P. Huntington in the West, were already raising their heads like vast mountains in connection with these enterprises. Among those who dreamed most ardently on this score was Jay Cooke, who, without the wolfish cunning of a Gould or the practical knowledge of a Vanderbilt, was ambitious to thread the northern reaches of America with a band of steel which should be a permanent memorial to his name. The project which fascinated him most was one that related to the development of the territory then lying almost unexplored between the extreme western shore of Lake Superior, where Duluth now stands, and that portion of the Pacific Ocean into which the Columbia River empties, the extreme northern one-third of the United States. Here, if a railroad were built, would spring up great cities and prosperous towns. There were, it was suspected, mines of various metals in the region of the Rockies, which this railroad would traverse, and untold wealth to be reaped from the fertile corn and wheat lands. Products brought only so far east as Duluth could then be shipped to the Atlantic via the Great Lakes and the Erie Canal at a greatly reduced cost. It was a vision of empire, not unlike the Panama Canal project of the same period, and one that bade fair apparently to be as useful to humanity. It had aroused the interest and enthusiasm of Cooke, because of the fact that the government had made a grant of vast areas of land on either side of the proposed track to the corporation that should seriously undertake it and complete it within a reasonable number of years, and because of the opportunity it gave him of remaining a distinguished public figure, he had eventually shouldered the project. It was open to many objections and criticisms, but the genius which had been sufficient to finance the Civil War was considered sufficient to finance the Northern Pacific Railroad. Cooke undertook it with the idea of being able to put the merits of the proposition before the people direct, not through the agency of any great financial corporation, and of selling to the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker the stock or shares that he wished to dispose of. It was a brilliant chance. His genius had worked out the sale of great government loans during the Civil War to the people direct in this fashion. Why not Northern Pacific certificates? For several years he conducted a pyrotechnic campaign, surveying the territory in question, organizing great railway construction corps, building hundreds of miles of track under most trying conditions, and selling great blocks of his stock, on which interest of a certain percentage was guaranteed. If it had not been that he knew little of railroad building personally, and that the project was so vast that it could not well be encompassed by one man, even so great a man, it might have proved successful, as under subsequent management it did. However, hard times, the war between France and Germany, which tied up European capital for the time being and made it indifferent to American projects, envy, calumny, a certain percentage of mismanagement, all conspired to wreck it. On September 18, 1873, at 12:15 noon, J. Cooke & Company failed for approximately $8 million, and the Northern Pacific for all that had been invested in it, some $50 million more. One can imagine what the result was, the most important financier and the most distinguished railway enterprise collapsing at one and the same time. "A financial thunderclap in a clear sky," said the Philadelphia Press. "No one could have been more surprised," said the Philadelphia Inquirer, "if snow had fallen amid the sunshine of a summer noon." The public, which by Cooke's previous tremendous success had been lulled into believing him invincible, could not understand it. It was beyond belief. J. Cooke fail? Impossible, or anything connected with him. Nevertheless, he had failed, and the New York Stock Exchange, after witnessing a number of crashes immediately afterward, closed for 8 days. The Lake Shore Railroad failed to pay a call loan of $1,750,000, and the Union Trust Company, allied to the Vanderbilt interests, closed its doors after withstanding a prolonged run. The National Trust Company of New York had $800,000 of government securities in its vaults, but not a dollar could be borrowed upon them, and it suspended. Suspicion was universal. Rumor affected everyone. In Philadelphia, when the news reached the stock exchange, it came first in the form of a brief dispatch addressed to the stock board from the New York Stock Exchange. Rumor on street of failure of J. Cook & Company. Answer. It was not believed, and so not replied to. Nothing was thought of it. The world of brokers paid scarcely any attention to it. Cowperwood, who had followed the fortunes of J. Cook & Company with considerable suspicion of its president's brilliant theory of vending his wares direct to the people, was perhaps the only one who had suspicions. He had once written a brilliant criticism to some inquirer, in which he had said that no enterprise of such magnitude as the Northern Pacific had ever before been entirely dependent upon one house, or rather upon one man, and that he did not like it. I am not sure that the lands through which the roads run are so unparalleled in climate, soil, timber, minerals, etc., as Mr. Cook and his friends would have us believe. Neither do I think that the road can at present, or for many years to come, earn the interest which its great issues of stock call for. There is great danger and risk there. So when the notice was posted, he looked at it, wondering what the effect would be if by any chance J. Cook & Company should fail. He was not long in wonder. A second dispatch posted on Change read, New York, September 18th. J. Cook & Company have suspended. Cowperwood could not believe it. He was beside himself with the thought of a great opportunity. In company with every other broker, he hurried into 3rd Street and up to number 114, where the famous old banking house was located, in order to be sure. Despite his natural dignity and reserve, he did not hesitate to run. If this were true, a great hour had struck. There would be widespread panic and disaster. There would be a terrific slump in prices of all stocks. He must be in the thick of it. Wingate must be on hand, and his 2 brothers. He must tell them how to sell, and when and what to buy. His great hour had come. Chapter 59. The banking house of J. Cook & Company, in spite of its tremendous significance as a banking and promoting concern, was a most unpretentious affair, 4 stories and a half in height, of gray stone and red brick. It had never been deemed a handsome or comfortable banking house. Cowperwood had been there often. Wharf rats, as long as the forearm of a man, crept up the culverted channels of Dock Street to run through the apartments at will. Scores of clerks worked under gas jets, where light and air were not any too abundant, keeping track of the firm's vast accounts. It was next door to the Girard National Bank, where Cowperwood's friend Davison still flourished, and where the principal financial business of the street converged. As Cowperwood ran, he met his brother Edward, who was coming to the stock exchange with some word for him from Wingate. "Run and get Wingate and Joe," he said. "There's something big on this afternoon. J. Cook has failed." Edward waited for no other word, but hurried off as directed. Cowperwood reached Cook & Company among the earliest. To his utter astonishment, the solid brown oak doors, with which he was familiar, were shut, and a notice posted on them, which he quickly read, ran, September 18th, 1873. To the public. We regret to be obliged to announce that, owing to unexpected demands on us, our firm has been obliged to suspend payment. In a few days we will be able to present a statement to our creditors, until which time we must ask their patient consideration. We believe our assets to be largely in excess of our liabilities. J. Cook & Company. A magnificent gleam of triumph sprang into Cowperwood's eye. In company with many others, he turned and ran back toward the exchange, while a reporter, who had come for information, knocked at the massive doors of the banking house, and was told by a porter, who peered out of a diamond-shaped aperture, that J. Cook had gone home for the day, and was not to be seen. Now, thought Cowperwood, to whom this panic spelled opportunity, not ruin, I'll get my innings. I'll go short of this, of everything. Before, when the panic following the Chicago fire had occurred, he had been compelled to stay long of many things in order to protect himself. Today he had nothing to speak of, perhaps a paltry $75,000, which he had managed to scrape together. Thank God he had only the reputation of Wingate's old house to lose, if he lost, which was nothing. With it as a trading agency behind him, with it as an excuse for his presence, his right to buy and sell, he had everything to gain. Where many men were thinking of ruin, he was thinking of success. He would have Wingate and his 2 brothers under him to execute his orders exactly. He could pick up a fourth and a fifth man if necessary. He would give them orders to sell everything, 10, 15, 20, 30 points off if necessary, in order to trap the unwary, depress the market, frighten the fearsome who would think he was too daring. And then he would buy, below these figures as much as possible, in order to cover his sales and reap a profit. His instinct told him how widespread and enduring this panic would be. The Northern Pacific was a $100 million venture. It involved the savings of hundreds of thousands of people, small bankers, tradesmen, preachers, lawyers, doctors, widows, institutions all over the land, and all resting on the faith and security of J. Cook. Once, not unlike the Chicago fire map, Cowperwood had seen a grand prospectus and map of the location of the Northern Pacific land grant, which Cook had controlled, showing a vast stretch or belt of territory extending from Duluth, the zenith city of the unsalted seas, as Proctor Knott, speaking in the House of Representatives, had sarcastically called it, through the Rockies and the headwaters of the Missouri to the Pacific Ocean. He had seen how Cook had ostensibly managed to get control of this government grant, containing millions upon millions of acres and extending 1,400 miles in length. But it was only a vision of empire. There might be silver and gold and copper mines there. The land was usable, would someday be usable. But what of it now? It would do to fire the imaginations of fools with, nothing more. It was inaccessible, and would remain so for years to come. No doubt thousands had subscribed to build this road, but, too, thousands would now fail if it had failed. Now the crash had come. The grief and the rage of the public would be intense. For days and days and weeks and months, normal confidence and courage would be gone. This was his hour. This was his great moment. Like a wolf prowling under glittering, bitter stars in the night, he was looking down into the humble folds of simple men and seeing what their ignorance and their unsophistication would cost them. He hurried back to the exchange, the very same room in which only 2 years before he had fought his losing fight, and finding that his partner and his brother had not yet come, began to sell everything in sight. Pandemonium had broken loose. Boys and men were fairly tearing in from all sections with orders from panic-struck brokers to sell, 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 and later with orders to buy. The various trading posts were reeling, swirling masses of brokers and their agents. Outside in the street in front of J. Cook & Company, Clark & Company, the Girard National Bank, and other institutions, immense crowds were beginning to form. They were hurrying here to learn the trouble, to withdraw their deposits, to protect their interests generally. A policeman arrested a boy for calling out the failure of J. Cook & Company, but nevertheless the news of the great disaster was spreading like wildfire. Among these panic-struck men, Cowperwood was perfectly calm, deadly cold, the same Cowperwood who had pegged solemnly at his 10 chairs each day in prison, who had baited his traps for rats, and worked in the little garden allotted him in utter silence and loneliness. Now he was vigorous and energetic. He had been just sufficiently about this exchange floor once more to have made his personality impressive and distinguished. He forced his way into the center of swirling crowds of men already shouting themselves hoarse, offering whatever was being offered in quantities which were astonishing, and at prices which allured the few who were anxious to make money out of the tumbling prices to buy. New York Central had been standing at 104 7/8 when the failure was announced, Rhode Island at 108 7/8, Western Pacific at 92 1/2. Wabash at 70 1/4, Panama at 117 3/8, Central Pacific at 99 5/8, St. Paul at 51, Hannibal and St. Joseph at 48, Northwestern at 63, Union Pacific at 26 3/4, Ohio and Mississippi at 38 3/4. Cowperwood's house had scarcely any of the stocks on hand. They were not carrying them for any customers, and yet he sold to whoever would take, at prices which he felt sure would inspire them. 5,000 of New York Central at 99, 98, 97, 96, 95, 94, 93, 92, 91, 90, 89, you might have heard him call. And when his sales were not sufficiently brisk, he would turn to something else. Rock Island, Panama, Central Pacific, Western Union, Northwestern, Union Pacific. He saw his brother and Wingate hurrying in, and stopped in his work long enough to instruct them. Sell everything you can, he cautioned them quietly, at 15 points off if you have to, no lower than that now, and buy all you can below it. Ed, you see if you cannot buy up some local street railways at 15 off. Joe, you stay near me and buy when I tell you. The secretary of the board appeared on his little platform. E. W. Clark & Company, he announced at 1:30, have just closed their doors. Tighe Company, he called at 1:45, announced that they are compelled to suspend.
"The First National Bank of Philadelphia," he called at 2 o'clock, "begs to state that it cannot at present meet its obligations." After each announcement, always, as in the past, when the gong had compelled silence, the crowd broke into an ominous "aw, aw, aw." Tighe Company, thought Cowperwood for a single second when he heard it. There's an end of him. And then he returned to his task. When the time for closing came, his coat torn, his collar twisted loose, his necktie ripped, his hat lost, he emerged sane, quiet, steady-mannered. "Well, Ed," he inquired, meeting his brother, "how'd you make out?" The latter was equally torn, scratched, exhausted. "Christ," he replied, tugging at his sleeves, "I never saw such a place as this. They almost tore my clothes off." "Buy any local street railways?" "About 5,000 shares." "We'd better go down to Green's," Frank observed, referring to the lobby of the principal hotel. "We're not through yet. There'll be more trading there." He led the way to find Wingate and his brother Joe, and together they were off, figuring up some of the larger phases of their purchases and sales as they went. And, as he predicted, the excitement did not end with the coming of the night. The crowd lingered in front of J. Cook & Company's on 3rd Street, and in front of other institutions, waiting apparently for some development which would be favorable to them. For the initiated, the center of debate and agitation was Green's Hotel, where on the evening of the 18th the lobby and corridors were crowded with bankers, brokers, and speculators. The stock exchange had practically adjourned to that hotel en masse. What of the morrow? Who would be the next to fail? From whence would money be forthcoming? These were the topics from each mind and upon each tongue. From New York was coming momentarily more news of disaster. Over there banks and trust companies were falling like trees in a hurricane. Cowperwood, in his preambulations, seeing what he could see and hearing what he could hear, reaching understandings which were against the rules of the exchange, but which were nevertheless in accord with what every other person was doing, saw about him men known to him as agents of Mollenhauer and Simpson, and congratulated himself that he would have something to collect from them before the week was over. He might not own a street railway, but he would have the means to. He learned from hearsay and information which had been received from New York and elsewhere that things were as bad as they could be, and that there was no hope for those who expected a speedy return of normal conditions. No thought of retiring for the night entered until the last man was gone. It was then practically morning. The next day was Friday, and suggested many ominous things. Would it be another Black Friday? Cowperwood was at his office before the street was fairly awake. He figured out his program for the day to a nicety, feeling strangely different from the way he had felt 2 years before when the conditions were not dissimilar. Yesterday, in spite of the sudden onslaught, he had made $150,000, and he expected to make as much, if not more, today. There was no telling what he could make, he thought, if he could only keep his small organization in perfect trim and get his assistants to follow his orders exactly. Ruin for others began early with the suspension of Fisk and Hatch, Jay Cook's faithful lieutenants during the Civil War. They had calls upon them for $1,500,000 in the first 15 minutes after opening the doors, and at once closed them again, the failure being ascribed to Collis P. Huntington's Central Pacific Railroad and the Chesapeake and Ohio. There was a long continued run on the Fidelity Trust Company. News of these facts and of failures in New York posted on Change strengthened the cause Cowperwood was so much interested in, for he was selling as high as he could and buying as low as he could on a constantly sinking scale. By 12 o'clock he figured with his assistants that he had cleared $100,000, and by 3 o'clock he had $200,000 more. That afternoon between 3 and 7 he spent adjusting his trades, and between 7 and 1 in the morning, without anything to eat, in gathering as much additional information as he could and laying his plans for the future. Saturday morning came, and he repeated his performance of the day before, following it up with adjustments on Sunday and heavy trading on Monday. By Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock he figured that, all losses and uncertainties to one side, he was once more a millionaire, and that now his future lay clear and straight before him. As he sat at his desk late that afternoon in his office looking out into 3rd Street, where a hurrying of brokers, messengers, and anxious depositors still maintained, he had the feeling that so far as Philadelphia and the life here was concerned, his day and its day with him was over. He did not care anything about the brokerage business here any more or anywhere. Failures such as this, and disasters such as the Chicago fire that had overtaken him 2 years before, had cured him of all love of the stock exchange and all feeling for Philadelphia.
He had been very unhappy here in spite of all his previous happiness, and his experience as a convict had made him, he could see quite plainly, unacceptable to the element with whom he had once hoped to associate.
There was nothing else to do, now that he had re-established himself as a Philadelphia businessman and been pardoned for an offense which he hoped to make people believe he had never committed, but to leave Philadelphia to seek a new world. "If I get out of this safely," he said to himself, "this is the end. I am going west, and going into some other line of business." He thought of street railways, land speculation, some great manufacturing project of some kind, even mining on a legitimate basis. "I've had my lesson," he said to himself, finally getting up and preparing to leave. "I am as rich as I was, and only a little older. They caught me once, but they will not catch me again." He talked to Wingate about following up the campaign on the lines in which he had started, and he himself intended to follow it up with great energy. But all the while his mind was running with this one rich thought: "I am a millionaire. I am a free man. I am only 36, and my future is all before me." It was with this thought that he went to visit Eileen and to plan for the future. It was only 3 months later that a train, speeding through the mountains of Pennsylvania and over the plains of Ohio and Indiana, bore to Chicago in the West the young financial aspirant who, in spite of youth and wealth and a notable vigor of body, was a solemn, conservative speculator as to what his future might be. The West, as he had carefully calculated before leaving, held much. He had studied the receipts of the New York clearinghouse recently, and the disposition of bank balances and the shipment of gold, and had seen that vast quantities of the latter metal were going to Chicago. He understood finance accurately. The meaning of gold shipments was clear. Where money was going, trade was, a thriving, developing life. He wished to see clearly for himself what this world had to offer. 2 years later, following the meteoric appearance of a young speculator in Duluth, and after Chicago had seen the tentative opening of a grain and commission company labeled Frank A. Cowperwood and Company, which ostensibly dealt in the great wheat crops of the West, a quiet divorce was granted Mrs. Frank A. Cowperwood in Philadelphia, because apparently she wished it. Time had not seemingly dealt badly with her. Her financial affairs, once so bad, were now apparently all straightened out, and she occupied in West Philadelphia, near one of her sisters, a new and interesting home, which was fitted with all the comforts of an excellent middle-class residence. She was now quite religious once more. The 2 children, Frank and Lillian, were in private schools, returning evenings to their mother. Wash Sims was once more the Negro general factotum. Frequent visitors on Sundays were Mr. and Mrs. Henry Worthington Cowperwood, no longer distressed financially, but subdued and wearied, the wind completely gone from their once much-favored sails. Cowperwood Sr. had sufficient money wherewith to sustain himself, and that without slaving as a petty clerk, but his social joy in life was gone. He was old, disappointed, sad. He could feel that with his quondam honor and financial glory he was the same, and he was not. His courage and his dreams were gone, and he awaited death. Here, too, came Anna Adelaide Cowperwood on occasion, a clerk in the city water office, who speculated much as to the strange vicissitudes of life. She had great interest in her brother, who seemed destined by fate to play a conspicuous part in the world, but she could not understand him. Seeing that all those who were near to him in any way seemed to rise or fall with his prosperity, she did not understand how justice and morals were arranged in this world. There seemed to be certain general principles, or people assumed they were, but apparently there were exceptions. Assuredly her brother abided by no known rule, and yet he seemed to be doing fairly well once more. What did this mean? Mrs. Cowperwood, his former wife, condemned his actions, and yet accepted of his prosperity as her due. What were the ethics of that? Cowperwood's every action was known to Eileen Butler, his present whereabouts and prospects. Not long after his wife's divorce, and after many trips to and from this new world in which he was now living, these 2 left Philadelphia together one afternoon in the winter. Eileen explained to her mother, who was willing to go and live with Nora, that she had fallen in love with the former banker and wished to marry him. The old lady, gathering only a garbled version of it at first, consented. Thus ended forever for Eileen this long-continued relationship with this older world. Chicago was before her. A much more distinguished career, Frank told her, than ever they could have had in Philadelphia. "Isn't it nice to be finally going?" she commented. "It is advantageous, anyhow," he said. Concerning Mycteroperca bonacci. There is a certain fish, the scientific name of which is Mycteroperca bonacci, its common name black grouper, which is of considerable value as an afterthought in this connection, and which deserves to be better known. It is a healthy creature, growing quite regularly to a weight of 250 pounds, and lives a comfortable, lengthy existence because of its very remarkable ability to adapt itself to conditions. That very subtle thing which we call the creative power, and which we endow with the spirit of the Beatitudes, is supposed to build this mortal life in such fashion that only honesty and virtue shall prevail. Witness then the significant manner in which it has fashioned the black grouper. One might go far afield and gather less forceful indictments. The horrific spider spinning his trap for the unthinking fly, the lovely drosera, sundew, using its crimson calyx for a smothering pit in which to seal and devour the victim of its beauty, the rainbow-colored jellyfish that spreads its prismed tentacles like streamers of great beauty, only to sting and torture all that falls within their radiant folds. Man himself is busy digging the pit and fashioning the snare, but he will not believe it. His feet are in the trap of circumstance, his eyes are on an illusion. Mycteroperca, moving in its dark world of green waters, is as fine an illustration of the constructive genius of nature, which is not beatific, as any which the mind of man may discover. Its great superiority lies in an almost unbelievable power of simulation, which relates solely to the pigmentation of its skin. In electrical mechanics, we pride ourselves on our ability to make over one brilliant scene into another in the twinkling of an eye, and flash before the gaze of an onlooker picture after picture, which appear and disappear as we look. The directive control of Mycteroperca over its appearance is much more significant. You cannot look at it long without feeling that you are witnessing something spectral and unnatural, so brilliant is its power to deceive. From being black, it can become instantly white. From being an earth-colored brown, it can fade into a delightful water-colored green. Its markings change as the clouds of the sky. One marvels at the variety and subtlety of its power. Lying at the bottom of a bay, it can simulate the mud by which it is surrounded. Hidden in the folds of glorious leaves, it is of the same markings. Lurking in the flaw of light, it is like the light itself shining dimly in water. Its power to elude or strike unseen is of the greatest. What would you say was the intention of the overruling, intelligent, constructive force which gives to Mycteroperca this ability? To fit it to be truthful? To permit it to present an unvarying appearance which all honest, life-seeking fish may know? Or would you say that subtlety, chicanery, trickery were here at work? An implement of illusion one might readily suspect it to be, a living lie, a creature whose business it is to appear what it is not, to simulate that with which it has nothing in common, to get its living by great subtlety, the power of its enemies to forfend against which is little. The indictment is fair. Would you say, in the face of this, that a beatific, beneficent creature, overruling power, never wills that which is either trickery or deceptive? Or would you say that this material seeming in which we dwell is itself an illusion? If not, whence then the 10 Commandments and the illusion of justice? Why were the Beatitudes dreamed of, and how do they avail? The Magic Crystal. If you had been a mystic or a soothsayer or a member of that mysterious world which divines by incantations, dreams, the mystic bowl, or the crystal sphere, you might have looked into their mysterious depths at this time and foreseen a world of happenings which concerned these two, who were now apparently so fortunately placed. In the fumes of the witch's pot, or the depths of the radiant crystal, might have been revealed cities, 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 a world of mansions, carriages, jewels, beauty, a vast metropolis outraged by the power of one man, a great state seething with indignation over a force it could not control, vast halls of priceless pictures, a palace unrivaled for its magnificence, a whole world reading with wonder at times of a given name. And sorrow, sorrow, sorrow. The 3 witches that hailed Macbeth upon the blasted heath might in turn have called to Cowperwood.
Hail to you, Frank Cowperwood, master of a great railway system. Hail to you, Frank Cowperwood, builder of a priceless mansion. Hail to you, Frank Cowperwood, patron of arts and possessor of endless riches. You shall be famed hereafter.
But like the weird sisters, they would have lied, for in the glory was also the ashes of Dead Sea fruit, an understanding that could neither be inflamed by desire nor satisfied by luxury, a heart that was long since wearied by experience, a soul that was as bereft of illusion as a windless moon. And to Eileen, as to Macduff, they might have spoken a more pathetic promise, one that concerned hope and failure, to have and not to have, all the seeming and yet the sorrow of not having, brilliant society that shone in the mirage yet locked its doors, love that eluded as a will-o'-the-wisp and died in the dark.
Hail to you, Frank Cowperwood, master and no master, prince of the world of dreams whose reality was disillusion.
So might the witches have called, the bowl have danced with figures, the fumes with vision, and it would have been true. What wise man might not read from such a beginning such an end?